Okay, I will bring the Assembly Finance Committee meeting of March 1st to order. Thank you guys for being flexible and switching to Zoom today at the last minute. Ms. Beagle, will you please note our roll?
Thank you, Chair Treem. All Assembly members are present virtually here on Zoom, besides Assembly Member Smith and Assembly Member Bryson, who are currently absent.
Okay, thank you. I believe they might be joining us later, so hopefully they will. Approval of minutes. Does anybody have any corrections or additions to the minutes from the February 1st meeting? Seeing none, those minutes are approved, and we will move straight to our first agenda topic, which is our audit presentation. We have Ms. Tarver here from LG Rayfield. Mr. Rogers, do you have anything you want to say before we get started?
Thank you, Chair Treem. I'll just say, as I do every time when Ms. Tarver is with us, Ms. Tarver is your employee. Auditors work for governing bodies. They don't necessarily work for staff. So the point is that you get to have direct contact with her and the work that's done by LG Rayfield in auditing both the city, the school district, and the hospital. I have already disclosed to the Assembly that CBJ's audit is significantly delayed this year for a lot of different reasons. That audit actually remains delayed. Ms. Tarver agreed to present tonight draft findings, draft conclusions. It is possible that those conclusions, of course, would change. And Ms. Tarver is here to talk you through what that is. And after Ms. Tarver is done, I think we can talk about whether or not the Assembly Finance Committee would like Ms. Tarver to come back and present final findings or not. That'll be entirely up to you. This is obviously not the way that we hope for this to go. It's been an extraordinary year for a number of reasons. And I think other than that, I would leave it to Ms. Tarver.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rogers. And I will note that Mr. Bryson has joined us. So Ms. Tarver, take it away.
Great, thank you. So I think I'm familiar with most of you are familiar with me. Again, I'm Karen Tarver. I am a partner with LG Rayfield. Obviously, I can't show you our whole audit team, but it's not just me doing your audits, but I am the one that's going to do the presentation. I do have a PowerPoint, so bear with me as I share my screen. Hopefully that's going to work, and then I will go through that. And if there are questions, please just interrupt and we'll go through them, or we can go through them at the end.
Okay. And Assembly members, if you could raise your virtual hand so I can see you if you have questions.
That would be great. Thank you. So as Mr. Rogers said, the audit is happening a little later, or we're concluding the city audit later. As I mentioned, it's not just me auditing. So you can see, as our services to the city, we do the city's audit, Bartlett audit, and Juneau School District audit. And there are many people here in the firm that participate and work with your staff on those audits as listed on the screen. The timing of our audits, I'm going to start at the bottom. Juneau School District, we do that field work in July and September. We did issue their audit reports and compliance audits reports and financial statement audit report in November. For Bartlett, that field work is typically in August and September, and those financial statements were issued in November. For the city this year, we did do some preliminary work in August. The original planned dates for your field work were in October and November, with a planned issuance date by December 31. As Mr. Rogers explained, there have been delays in getting us the information that we needed to complete our audit procedures. And so as a result, that audit has lengthened in time, and we are on track though to issue here in March. We just couldn't quite pull it together for this meeting. And so management and finance department specifically and treasury are working hard to get us the final information that we need. And then in addition to that, for your financial statement audit are your compliance audits, and those also will be issued in March. So CBJ is the primary government. Again, thinking through how that works is that we're issuing opinions on various aspects of the government. And so as this slide kind of shows, the reporting entity is the governmental funds, the proprietary or business type funds, and then you have a few other fiduciary type funds. Specific to CBJ itself, again, your general, we have what's called major funds, and those are the ones that we actually opine on, and that is your general fund is always major. You have your debt service fund is major. 2 of your special revenue funds are major. And then also within your enterprise funds, those are all major. And then for the aggregate non-major funds, we're also issuing an opinion over them, but they are all grouped together and our opinion covers all of them. And then the internal service funds are allocated into your governmental and business type activities. And so we audit those through those funds as well. And you do have 2 fiduciary funds as well that are subject to audit. You'll hear us talk about the ACFR. So accountants tend to use lots of acronyms. So I wanted to make sure the ACFR is the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report. So as I mentioned, what we are auditing is what's called your basic financial statements. And we issue an opinion over the statements that are listed on the screen now. And so really that includes the high level, the summarized financial statements of the primary government and the notes to those financial statements. There's also what's called required supplementary information. And this is information that basically GASB is Government Accounting Standard Boards. They dictate how you guys have to put your financial statements together. And this is information that they require as part of governmental auditing or audited financial statements. And we don't actually issue an opinion over this information, but it is included in your ACFR. And we read through it. We make sure there's not significant variances from the basic financial statements. But again, we don't issue an opinion over these items. There's also supplementary information. And for the combining and individual fund statements, as well as some of the capital project funds, we do issue what's called an in relation to opinion. So what that means is we review this information and we make sure that it is materially correct in relation to the basic financial statements. So using the schedule of current and closed capital projects as an example, we look at those, we make sure that those totals agree to what is in your basic financial statements. The other supplementary information is the introductory section and the statistical section. Again, we don't issue an opinion on those, but we do go through and look at them and make sure that they agree to the statements, but we don't issue an opinion. So the CBJ, or the primary government, is the only one that actually issues an ACFR. And then Bartlett has separately issued financial statements. And then the school district has separately issued financial statements. In both the city and school district, we also do federal and state compliance audits. Bartlett's grants are part of CBJ's compliance audits, because Bartlett, again, is a fund of the primary government. And they elected in the past to go ahead and get a separate audit and have separate audited financial statements. And that was primarily due to the timing of the city's ACFR being after they needed financial statements for their cost report. The significant transaction cycles that we look at as part of your audit are listed. You'll see slight differences. Obviously, Bartlett has a lot more patient service revenue and the cycles that relate to making sure that that information is recorded correctly. Both city and Bartlett have capital assets. Expenditures are at all 3 entities, and compliance obviously impacts all entities as well. So you don't have a printed report to look at or even a PDF of our report to look at. And so what I've included tonight will be what we're planning to issue. As I said, we feel like we are close to the point of being issued. We are kind of waiting for some final changes to the ACFR. And once those are ready, we will be able to issue our audit report. But this is what the audit report is going to look like. And the format has changed. Some of the narrative has changed from the prior format. That is a change that happened industry-wide. So one of the things it did is it moved the opinion, which used to be at the end of the letter, to the beginning of the letter, because really that is what you want to know from your audit and your audit report. And so to paraphrase what is on your screen, we are issuing an opinion over, again, as I talked about, those different opinion units. So your governmental funds or activities, rather, business type activities, each of the component units, each major fund, and the aggregate non-major information, as well as the notes. So again, the basic financial statements. And then the second paragraph there is our opinion. And so basically the financial statements present fairly in all material respects. And then it goes through the whole list again. As of June 30, 22, in accordance with accounting principles generally accepted in the United States. Again, we call that GAAP. So the wording, it's a generally accepted accounting principles. And so again, this is some key takeaways is in all material respects. So obviously we can't audit to the penny. We would live in city finance offices if we did that, and they would not be very happy. So again, our audit approach, we are looking at, is the information presented fairly, material respects, and in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And so our opinion here is an unmodified opinion, and that is what you want. So we didn't have any qualifications to the opinion. The basis of our opinion is, I mentioned, kind of the difference. So GAAP is what you have to follow as far as reporting. We follow what's called GAS, which is generally accepted auditing standards. And did I see a question or no? Okay. And so again, our responsibility is described a little bit later in a further paragraph. We also have to make sure we're communicating to you that we have to maintain our independence from the city and make sure that we, as part of our audit, get enough audit evidence to form the basis of our audit opinions. So management is responsible for the financial statements, and your finance and treasury put a lot of work into making sure that that ACFR is correct. And so they are also responsible for making sure that the internal controls are in place to have that information that ultimately gets reported to you in the ACFR. And so the second paragraph there is required disclosure information that basically management also has to look at. Is there any threats to continuing for the next 12 months, basically? And there were none disclosed or known. So our responsibility, again, is to issue an opinion over the financial statements. And again, the wording has changed here. What kind of the new wording is trying to communicate in more layman terms what we do, and we're providing reasonable assurance, which is a high level of assurance, not absolute assurance, that basically amounts and disclosures are materially correct. And so again, it kind of goes through and says what is a misstatement or what is material misstatement, and that last sentence described it. It's that if individually or in the aggregate, if it would influence judgment of the user of the financial statements. And so as part of our audit process, we have to basically think, would this impact the assembly of the finance committee's decision making? Would this impact possibly a bondholder's use of these financial statements? And that is how we then essentially quantify what materiality is for you. And that differs by fund or even by account. So a lot more is in your letter now regarding our responsibility. And under the GAS, basically, we have, as it says, to maintain or exercise professional judgment, maintains skepticism, and you can see it kind of goes through. And the ones that I wanted to highlight were just basically that we obtain an understanding of your internal controls, but we don't opine on your internal controls. But what we're looking at as we look through your internal controls is, has management put processes, procedures, are there policies in place to make sure that the information being captured in your ACFR is correct, essentially. And if it's not, we'll report to you, but we really use that information as we're looking at your internal controls to determine our audit procedures. And then that last section that we required to communicate to those charged in governance, so that is you, part of the finance committee management, among other matters, excuse me, the plan, scope, and time of the audit, if there's any findings, and if there's any internal control related matters. So that is part of what we're doing tonight, is fulfilling that responsibility. So I mentioned understanding internal controls. The audit process, this is a very high level process summary. First, we have to make sure we know what the controls are. So we come in, we talk a lot to your staff, we make sure we understand kind of the processes, we look at your documentation, what do you have in place, and then we decide which ones we feel like we can rely on, and we test those to make sure that they're operating effectively. Once we know, for example, that accounts payable transactions have good controls, that we know that when items are paid, they're approved, they're getting coded to the right place, that kind of information, that helps us then determine our audit approach when it comes down to like the balances that are reported in your ACFR. So the testing of balances and significant transactions and disclosures is the next step, and that we have developed a risk assessment for specific accounts or funds or disclosures, and we're spending our time making sure that that information was correct. Concluding our work, a lot of that is going back through everything and making sure sometimes if something's off in one place, it could affect other funds or other accounts. And so if we have a problem in one area, we kind of have to trace it through and make sure that it hasn't impacted other areas as well. And then we draft our audit reports and we issue. So we are kind of in that concluding work and drafting audit reports section right now of the audit. So there were some big things that impacted the FY22 audit. One was GASB, which again is Governmental Accounting Standards Board number 87, and it's on leases. And you've probably, those of you who've been on the finance committee for a while, we've been talking about leases for a while. We kept saying it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Well, it's here. And it took your finance office a significant amount of time this year. It was a huge undertaking to implement this. You know, they bought software to do it. And so again, that had a significant impact in that it changed how some information was reported, as well as a lot of new disclosure information related to the leases. COVID funding, you continue to have COVID funding that's being expended. It's a large percentage of your total grant funding, so that also had an impact on our audit approach. We did have the audit risks that were identified last year as part of the internal control issues that Bartlett had, so that impacted that audit or that fund. There was turnover in finance and treasury, and when that occurs, we also design audit procedures to make sure that we're looking at processes and making sure that when that turnover occurs, that information or processes don't get lost through the turnover process. And then budgetary compliance as part of the authority that you, the assembly, basically give to management for spending is your budget. And so we make sure that we're looking at that as well. And specifically that bullet point relates to the school district and kind of the issue that related to their deficit this last year. So going through the results of your other audits, the Bartlett Hospital audit, again, I know the board and finance, or the hospital board and finance committee met recently, and I believe went over their reports. But again, they did have a significant deficiency. It was a carryover from the prior year. It relates to the internal controls over kind of credit cards and that, and it was being resolved during fiscal year 22. But again, we have to look at the whole year, and during the year, there was a portion of the year where the control weaknesses were still there and hadn't been addressed yet. And so a detailed presentation was done for the Bartlett Finance Committee. And then, as I noted before, the federal and state grants at Bartlett are audited as part of the state's, or excuse me, the city's single audit. And so those aren't completed yet. For the school district, we had unmodified opinions, which again is what you want. We had no findings or question costs related to their compliance programs, and we had no audit adjustments. So that's all good news. And we did have findings, as I've presented to you in the past, related to compliance with the CBJ charter, and that was kind of related to their the fact that they went into a deficit position. And then they also had a significant deficiency related to their internal controls over their Medicaid billing. And that was really that they did not have billing that occurred in a timely manner. And that process had essentially broken, and they hadn't fixed it yet in fiscal year 22. We did have some informal communications with their management. Leases also impacted them, although not to the extent that the city has. And then we talked to them about making sure that their policies and procedures are being updated, looking at possible other methods for cash collections. Technology's changed so much now. There's a lot of electronic cash collection type things that can take place rather than cash, of allowing people to pay electronically rather. And then coordination with the state regarding FY23 budget. Since they do have that deficit, they will need to be coordinating with the state as far as their next year's budget. And we did do a presentation to the school board as well as finance committee. So the current status of your audit, as I mentioned, that the ACFR or financial statement audit is in process. We did have some significant delays in getting all the information and getting the draft ACFR. And so as a result of that, we have had delays. As I mentioned, though, we do expect to have unmodified opinions. We do have 2 findings, which I will go through in a moment. And then for your federal and state compliance, we again are working on those, but those were also delayed as a result of the ACFR delays. For your compliance audit, currently we have 1 major program. It counts for 55% of your total state funding that we're auditing. And for your federal programs, we have 4 what's called major programs. And that always, I have to tell you that sounds misleadingly easy. 4 programs, that's not that bad. Some of these programs have 10 to 12 grants within them. And so it's not quite as easy as 4 programs sounds, but we are making good progress on those. As you can see, some of that's airport related, CIP, and a lot of it was your COVID funding that was being expended either at the hospital or by CBJ itself. We also do an audit over your passenger facility charge schedule that's required by FAA, and that's also in progress and almost completed. So a lot of what I've been presenting tonight would be included and will be included in the letter to the assembly. And that is a written document that we'll be providing at the conclusion of their audit that includes these different topics. And I'm just going to go through some of them. Again, we're kind of verbally communicating before we've issued it, but we are far enough along in our audit that we feel that we don't feel the results will change. So the big change related to your accounting policies is obviously the GASB 87, which was the leases. There are some prior period adjustments also that will be showing in your ACFR, and that's a reclassification of a fund from an enterprise fund to a governmental fund, and then the correction of a fixed asset amount. So we also need to disclose, or we're supposed to disclose to you the significant estimates that are included in your financial statements. Management makes these estimates. We look at the basis of how they developed the estimates and conclude whether we feel are reasonable. In all cases, we did. Obviously, your pension and OPEB being other post-employment benefits, those amounts all come from the state, essentially, for the PERS, and then for the school district for the TERS program as well. And there's a lot of estimates involved in that information, that so your management isn't making those estimates. The state and the state auditors have that information, but that information is pulled into your financial statements. So for your accounts and assessments and receivables, a lot of what those estimates relate to is that management has to look at them and decide ultimately how much is going to be collected. So if you bill someone for a boat harbor use, is that person going to pay? What is the historical, if most people, if only 10% people are paying, then basically that would, you would create an allowance for that percentage that don't pay, rather than recognizing the whole thing as a receivable on your book. So we have to look at that estimate. For your self-insurance, obviously that involves some estimates related to the claims and what possible claims could be. The city does use an actuarial to assist in those estimates. And then your provider relief funds, which were, again, COVID-related funding that Bartlett had. The guidance for this money changed over time, and so it did involve some estimates as well. So uncorrected and corrected misstatements. So I have a bullet point here. It's still in progress as we work through the ACFR, but so I kind of just went ahead and put the list down. Some of these will be considered audit adjustments because that we identified them and asked management to correct them. Some management kind of detected in their own self-review and are working on correcting. But I guess one thing I do want to mention on this is that it's not necessarily something new. We usually have as kind of that back and forth review of the draft ACFR, and then it goes back to management. They are trying to put together the ACFR, which for those of you that remember, it's about 250 pages long. So it's a big document. That's being put together as we audit. And so sometimes what happens is that they'll give us information while they're still working on something. So then it changes. And so what we have to evaluate is like, well, is that something that management found themselves and they're correcting, or did we detect it? And so we did have some changes throughout the audit to the financial statement information that was initially provided to us to audit. And so that kind of leads us to our first internal control, what's called a material weakness. So material weakness is an internal control breakdown that is significant enough, we're communicating it to you. It's also significant enough that we feel like it could have a material impact on the financial statements. So if we had not come in and audited your numbers, and if you had received your ACFR as originally kind of drafted to us to audit, the information in there could have impacted your decisions had it not been corrected, is kind of how we value that materiality or determine that materiality. And so what we found is that the process, the ACFR, as that information is pulled together, it was, as you know, it's been delayed. This isn't the first year. It's been over last few years that it's been a struggle to pull the information together. I think you have a lot more federal and state funding than you used to, and that takes a lot of time. The number of construction projects that have to be reconciled take a lot of time. And those are kind of two of the areas where I feel like that information wasn't fully finished or reconciled when we started our audit. And so as a result, both the grants and construction projects can impact all funds, because both those things are in almost all funds. And so as a result, then what happens is that management was able to kind of complete stuff, but then they couldn't finish it all the way. And also, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the process, but your ACFR, so the document that you end up looking at, is a collection of about 50 odd Excel workbooks that have links between them. And one of the things that happened this year is some of those links broke. And and so it wasn't pulling in the right information. And so there was considerable time kind of going back and management rechecking those and making sure that the information was being pulled correctly. And so really our recommendation, and again, before I talk about the recommendation, a lot of what we found isn't necessarily new. It's just that with the turnover that you've had in both Treasury and Finance, I think it kind of highlighted some of these things in that the processes didn't have maybe complete documentation. And so when you leave, you kind of lose some of that institutional knowledge of, oh yeah, I have to make sure that this workbook agrees to this workbook. And so that, that's part of it. The software, I mentioned the 50 odd workbooks. The process was developed back when the city used Lotus. For those of you that remember Lotus 123, it was way before Excel. So, and that process really has gone unchanged since then. And so your accounting system, Lawson, basically is used for your accounting, but there's a lot of spreadsheets that have to be maintained outside of Lawson in order to actually correctly capture the information needed for your ACFR. And so when I say software, within our recommendation that we're saying, looking at the software used, it's not necessarily that you can go out and just buy off-the-shelf software to fix this problem. It's kind of looking at that whole process that has been in place for a very long time and thinking through, are there ways to improve the use of Excel to, strengthen the lengthening, strengthen internal kind of checks and balances that are within the workbooks. Even looking at compiling it all into one workbook. So there's a lot of different options. We've been exploring these in detail with management. So I guess I just wanted to make sure when I say software, it's not necessarily that there's like a solution out there on the shelf that you can just go buy. It's more internally going through your process. And then the other thing is looking at the procedures and resources used for reviewing. And this comment isn't new either. The accountants prepare a lot of the information, but then everything kind of feeds up to the controller. And the controller is, and even by your charter, the controller is the one that is in charge of pulling the ACFR together. And so it kind of comes down to that one person. They get very involved in the details. And when you're involved in the details, it's hard to step back and look at it from that high level. And so that's where resources come into play, in that once you have the ACFR pulled together, for example, having a checklist that goes through and says, okay, I need to make sure that this agrees to this page, and that's what we're seeing, is that while some resources are used, there are a lot more out there that could be used. And management, we've talked at length with your current controller and with Mr. Rogers, and I believe they're in agreement with this. This is something that's been in their minds as well, as again looking at this process. And I think this year, unfortunately, it just, all the little issues kind of bubbled up, and you're having significant delays in pulling the information together for this year. So I'll pause there and ask if there's any questions on that before I go to the next one.
Any questions? Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Tarver. So this is probably an easy question or a simple question, but what do you mean by complete a formal evaluation? What does that look like?
To me, it would be putting a think tank together, essentially, of the key people involved in the ACFR preparation. And Mr. Rogers and I have already talked about doing a kind of like, after we finally get the audit completed this year, is going back and talking about, okay, how does this information come to us? Where could improvements be made? I think it even goes further in that within your finance department and treasury department, looking at the different tasks and who's in charge of kind of what funds, that kind of stuff, and then looking at how does that translate to at the year end when you're pulling the ACFR together, who's doing what parts of it, right? And so when I say formal evaluation, I guess it's really developing a plan and kind of going through like, okay, what isn't working? So what do we do to correct it? And then kind of coming up with a timeline for those corrections.
Any other questions? I don't see any more hands, so you can keep going.
Okay. And I know you guys have a full agenda, so I will speed it up. I'm sorry. So the second thing is a significant deficiency. So the difference between a material weakness and a significant deficiency is that this is significant enough we want to communicate to you, but we don't feel that it could have caused a material misstatement in the financial statements. And this related to your lease standard implementation. As I mentioned, this was a large undertaking and software was purchased to assist with this. But what we found is that the documentation wasn't retained on decisions made in the software. So there are certain, without getting into all the technical aspects of it, you have to make a lot of decisions about what leases qualify, what don't, what discount rate you're going to apply to these. And so what didn't happen is is not a document out there to describe essentially the process that was used to essentially adopt this new standard. And then in addition to that, obviously finance is going to be kind of the one that's in charge of putting this together for financial reporting purposes, but the leases are really out at the departmental level. And so there has to be communication, there has to be documentation that the departments can use, because right now there's none. So if I have a lease and I'm the department, I don't know who to, how to communicate that this lease changed or that it was terminated or I entered into a new lease. And so that's where we feel that the documentation part of the implementation did not occur, and it needs to be developed over this next year to make sure that for this next ACFR, essentially there's adequate guidance for the departments as well as finance. Any questions on that comment? Seeing none or hearing none. So I mentioned this one again, because Bartlett is a fund of the city, this is a significant deficiency that was reported through Bartlett. It also would then flow into the city's report. As I mentioned, this related to control deficiencies that were present in the FY21 audit that weren't resolved yet fully in 22. And then we let you know if there's other internal control matters. So these are just other areas that we usually talk to management about. And so we've already mentioned essentially specific to leases that making sure that those financial policies and procedures are developed. In one of the things we did this year is we did a questionnaire out to all the department heads and kind of asked them, do you have the resources you need? Do you have policies and procedures that are clear? Again, focused on the financial aspects of their department. And some of the feedback we got is that they felt like finance was doing a really good job. They feel like they know finance is working hard, but they did say they felt like either the guidance they had maybe was outdated and hadn't been updated. And this isn't unique to CBJ, especially with COVID and the pandemic over the last few years. Updating policies and procedures is never high on anyone's priority list. And so especially with COVID, we're just finding a lot of entities aren't doing it. And so taking the time to go back and kind of revamp, review financial related policies and procedures. Again, with time, it would be great if those were available online through a portal probably, or something where the departments would have access to them and they could be updated essentially real time as needed. So that's something we're talking to management about. And I think it was also on their radar as well. Kind of also related to that, and I've already mentioned, kind of finance and treasury, looking at their task management, again, possibly aligning that to the act for preparation, and how that could possibly strengthen the act for preparation. And then the bottom one is just that we've been talking about different software with them, just the use of Excel or other software that could essentially help that act for preparation process. So I also have to report to you if there were prior year findings. So as I mentioned, this Bartlett one was considered repeated because of the timing. And then we did have another internal control matter comment last year, which was to further develop and document accounting procedures. And so again, we continue to recommend that, and especially as it relates to the act for preparation. So I wanted to make sure I put a slide in here so I'd remember to do it, to thank Treasury Finance, the school district finance, and Bartlett Finance for their staff and management's time. It's never, an audit is never a pleasant experience. We try to make it painless, but it's still never fun having someone question what you do and why you do it. And we ask a lot of questions. We know it's been challenging this year. And I just want to let you know that everyone we worked with has been very professional and really worked hard to get us what we needed to complete our audit. And while it is delayed, I did want to make sure that you knew how hard they have been working to try to get the audit completed. And as always, I'm always happy to sit down with members of the Assembly or Finance Committee if they have questions about audit. I like to talk about audits, so I'm happy to provide any information that you feel like you would like to know about audits. And that concludes my presentation. I was going to stay online and be online for a little bit more of your meeting. So I am available for questions now, or if they come up later in the meeting as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Tarver. It looks like we have a question from Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Ms. Tarver, for being here. I'll just speak for myself and say, this is a lot to process, given, we kind of just got the slides this afternoon and haven't, had a written materials to digest, but thank you for giving us an overview anyways. Given that it might take some processing time for the Assembly, just seeing this, is there anything that needs to be happening now to address some of these things that's not happening, or is it okay to kind of wait for the rest of for the final findings before we have a little more in-depth conversation?
I could defer to Mr. Rogers, but I guess from an auditor's perspective, your staff are doing exactly what they need to, which is working through the final draft of the ACFR to get that to us so that we can complete our audit, as well as on the federal and state compliance audits. They're working on getting us the information that we need to finish those programs. So from that aspect, I think everything's going along. I think after that's done is kind of that regroup time of kind of going back and reviewing, like, okay, what can we do better? And I know that's already Mr. Rogers has spoken to me that, and so has your controller, that is something that they really want to do kind of after the audit is done, since the focus right now is just getting the audit completed.
Any other questions for Ms. Tarver right now? I think Mr. Rogers is going to speak to some of these things. Mayor Weldon.
I guess I'll just be the simple one tonight. Is there anything that alarmed you or concerned you? Are you confident they're working through the issues?
Good question. I am confident they are working through the issues, and some of the things that we noted, take some time and research to affect, again, having those multiple workbooks, sometimes you have to make sure that it's flowing through correctly. And so it's just a time-consuming process. And so they are definitely very responsive to any feedback we've given them.
I have a question for you. I do remember that we heard about the GASB standard about leases for quite a while before it actually was implemented. And I think we're leasing the software that we're using to keep track of leases, but are there any other changes on the horizon that'll have big impacts on what we do?
That is a very good question. And actually the software question is exactly what it is. So the next big GASB implementation that you'll have to do is related to just that. It's software subscriptions and how those are accounted for and disclosed. And so similar to leases, this it could have an impact citywide. Again, a lot of what is involved with implementing something like that is getting the completeness is the hardest part, to making sure that you have identified correctly the whole population that is subject to that new standard, and then applying the standard to it. And a lot of that will be just additional disclosures and maybe some changes to kind of how those subscriptions are captured in your accounting system. But again, management's working on that, and they have another year before it's implemented.
Okay. Mr. Rogers, do you want to wrap things up?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Treem. I mean, I just make very, very clear, as I've said before, I take the delay in the audit very, very seriously. I take the material weakness finding very seriously. As Ms. Tarver could tell you, she and I have been on the phone almost daily for the last couple of months. So I am tremendously engaged. I appreciate that Ms. Tarver went through in some detail the technical problems that present themselves that result in that finding. When I started at CBJ 4 years ago, the budget book was built largely the same way that we build the ACFR. In fact, because the same people had originated both of those documents, both of those processes, they really were mirror images of each other. Over the last 4 years, I took on the budget half of that technical challenge. And the way that we build the budget today is completely different than how we built it 4 years ago. So that series of linked and interlocking spreadsheets that is used for the ACFR and what used to be used for the budget is no longer used for the budget. The entire budget, that 200 and some page book that comes out, that you see, comes out of one Excel workbook. We have solved the technology problem on the budget side, and I admit that I have been remiss not to solve that same problem in the controller's office with the ACFR. So it remains something that I highly focus on. I do believe we can solve this problem. I have plans with Ms. Tarver to do a deep dive and a postmortem, both directly one-on-one with Ms. Tarver and I, but also with the controller's office and other staff involved, so that we understand exactly how we're going to do this differently next year. A piece of software might help. I was actually at a government finance officers conference down here asking some colleagues about whether they were using those kinds of softwares, and I got a lot of the same answer, which is no, we still do it in Excel. But I think that there's a more streamlined mechanical method. We've certainly solved this problem on the budget side, and it was very similarly shaped. I do believe similarly we can solve it on the ACFR side. I think we need some skill development and some creative thinking that goes into that, remaking that process. But I will just finish up my remarks by thanking Ms. Tarver. She has been really a trooper in all of this. We have put a big demand on Ms. Tarver and LG Rayfeld with our delays and our technical challenges. And Ms. Tarver has really been quite an ally in working through those challenges with us. Now, admittedly, Ms. Tarver's job is to stand in judgment, and I respect that job. And so I don't disagree with anything that she's relayed to you tonight. And I am 100% focused on resolving those challenges as much as I can in the time that I have left.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. And we are, of course, we'll have the final audit distributed to the assembly and through whatever means that happens. Mr. Rogers and I had talked about whether we would bring Ms. Tarver back for another presentation. My sense was that we didn't need another presentation, and Mr. Rogers and I were going to meet with Ms. Tarver to go over the final findings, and anybody who is interested in joining can certainly do that unless there's a, the committee feels otherwise, that we want to have Ms. Tarver come back to a committee meeting. So let me know how you feel about that. Ms. Wall, I was going to invite you to our meeting. Okay. And anybody else, if you want to, just let me know. So, okay, thank you, Ms. Tarver, for that. I look forward to talking to you soon, probably with some friends. So we'll see you later. Does anybody want to take a break before we dive into the next item, or should we just keep on rolling? Little break. Okay, we will take a 5-minute break and come back at 6:57. Which is the JSD request for supplemental FY23 funding outside the cap, and we will kick it off with Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. I've had several questions from Assembly members as to whether this funding request would be potentially problematic. And I think the base is the desire to confirm whether Department of Education Early Development would agree that the school district has additional outside the cap eligible expenditures in this fiscal year. So I'm assuming everybody wants that information. And I think the next step is for CBJ staff to work with school district and DEED to confirm that there are allowable expenditures in FY23. And then I just want to point out also that this is a significant, if this is represents eligible expenditures, and the Assembly funds this would be a significant increase in our historical outside the cap funding. And so that I think you should anticipate that if this is funding and it's eligible, that you're going to see this in subsequent fiscal years. So I think that's the lead in. Several of you are interested in indeed confirming that there are eligible expenditures. And then the question of, if so, what happens in future fiscal years? It only makes sense to me the school district would request funding in these amounts. So those are the comments that I have for you.
Okay, so that is something that you are in the process of doing.
We'll start. We haven't
Okay,
started.
okay. Mayor Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was talking to Superintendent Weiss today, and I understand a little bit differently than what Mr. Watt said. From my understanding, this is deficit on the budget fund balance deficit. So I don't know that this would be a recurring request year after year, but I think we're all a little concerned. With that being said, I think we're all concerned that we already did 2.275 million outside the cap, and now they're just asking additional 2.5. But so if superintendent could address that, if this is going to be a reoccurring thing, or is this we're just trying to get them back to neutral, or up, I guess, past neutral, if we're trying to fill their fund balances for them. Thanks.
I am sure that Ms. Weiss will address that. But we've got questions already. Ms. Glaszewski and this Ms. Houston Scandies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I could wait to, you want me to ask a question or wait to answer the one that just got asked, or no? Or maybe we don't. Sorry, I thought the mayor had a question.
Madam-
I'll be happy to.
I did have a question. My question was, is this just filling up the fund balances in a one-shot deal, or is this
Okay.
going to be a reoccurring thing?
I'm sure that Dr. Weiss has a plan for presenting to us. Let's let her start, and then we'll ask questions as we go.
Okay.
So Dr. Weiss and Ms. Sorensen, however you want to split this up.
Thank you, Chair Treem and members of the Assembly. To answer that specific question, this request is certainly not a typical request at the timing that we are presenting it to you. In the past, sorry, I'm still recovering, so I'm going to try not to cough, but in the past, you know that there have been times the board has come back to you when, as an example, enrollment has been higher than projected. So in the old formula, when enrollment triggered the assemblies, the city's contribution amount, we would often come in the winter and say, oh, we got more kids, and so we're asking you to give us more local contribution that is eligible because of that enrollment. Now we have a formula that operates different than that based on the mill rate. So the actual enrollment influx or not doesn't change that allowable contribution. So this is not a request based on enrollment, but it's similar to that. So we're looking at our budget throughout the year, and given new information, trying to make adjustments in real time versus waiting too long and then having issues because we didn't adapt our budget along the way. So this request is coming as a result of some changes in need, and looking now at that we do have our enrollment, what some of those deficits would be. So for instance, and I would say one other thing that might help people with connecting some dots. In the past, what we've done is we've come to you in our budget request for the next year and asked for support in resolving some deficits that we incurred the year before. So part of this request is in knowing now, because we have all the information, what debt, for instance, in transportation, we're going to incur this year. And rather than asking you in next year's budget, we're asking you now because we want to make sure that those deficits don't catch us off guard in the June audit. And so we're trying to be more responsive to budgetary needs in real time as we can, as part of our measures in ensuring that we don't end up in the same place June 30th.
Okay. Any questions? Or Ms. Sorensen, is there anything you'd like to add at the beginning here?
Not right now.
Or? Okay. Okay, so we'll go to questions. We'll start with Ms. Gladaszewski and then Ms. Hughes-Gandies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for coming, and for something like this, I'm going to need a primer and some assurance about where these numbers came from. It's a one-page memo with a $2.5 million ask. There was money for Raleigh before, and now there's a different money for Raleigh, and there was money for middle school activities. Now there's another number. How do we know these are the right numbers? How did you find new eligible expenses that, presumably all these years, finance directors at the school district have calculated all this stuff, right? All these eligible outside the cap or these things that go outside the cap. And you've been doing it to the maximum because you've been getting, we say yes generally to those asks, but now all of a sudden there's an extra $2.5 million. And I just don't understand how you got there, how we got there. There were, so I know somebody is researching whether these are eligible, the legalities of this issue. In that whole ball of extra work to do, I need to understand how confident you are in these numbers and if they're real or estimates or, those kinds of things. It just seems like a, out of the blue, one page thing. So that's kind of a comment for more information.
Dr. Weiss?
Thank you. Yes. Again, we have assurance from DEED. We don't have an official memo, but we have checked in with DEED. There isn't an amount that is limited on the above the cap outside the allowable amount. It is categorically necessary that those requests fit certain expectations. And we know that these categories already do that. The one question that was raised to me around summer school, we verified that as an example with deed, and we found out that it was allowable. It fits the criteria for outside of the cap. We also had Robert Palmer, when the board first discussed this, he also checked from his vantage point to see if there were any hiccups on that, and he did not find any as well. The numbers again are based on what we know with enrollment. Our enrollment came under projection. So as an example, with transportation, our transportation funding is per student. There is when we went into COVID and we had a drop in enrollment, as an example, there was a hold harmless statute that supported us for a couple of years. That was true for general funding, but it was not true of transportation funding. It doesn't, there is no hold harmless for transportation. So when we anticipated our need for transportation support, when we presented to you last spring, it was different because we are under projection for our students. Transportation funding per student is the same today as it was when we started school in August of 2015. So the amount we get per student is the same today as it was in August of 2015. That obviously creates a challenge because the cost of transportation, the cost of fuel, all those things that impact that over the course of the last 8 years is pretty significant. So we're doing a lot of advocating at the Hill related to that, but that is the cost, is the current challenge that we have with transportation. For Rally, I'll just run through each of these and say a few things and then open it back up maybe, but I'll touch briefly on each one and then I can do deeper depending on where the questions are, if that seems best use of time. Rally and community schools are two programs that the district runs for our community. They are non-K-12 programs. We are looking at those programs closely. As you know, we've been doing that for Rally for a number of years. We are having a big challenge, like so many businesses in the community are, with staffing. So in Rally, what we've discovered this year is in order for us to staff it, the only way that we can find people that are qualified, because there's a higher bar because it's licensed, is to hire our existing staff, our classified staff, and have them work after school. And because of our negotiated agreement, that means we're paying overtime, which is more expensive. So there's increased costs. If we pass those costs on to the family, then what we've discovered is it makes it unaffordable. So in our mutual goal around having affordable childcare and high quality affordable childcare in the community, we're attempting to facilitate this program. While we can, we're doing that, and we need some support in doing that. Again, this is a non-K-12 program, and we're looking at, if we can't continue to run it, then we may have to, make other options available. If the city runs it, or if a private company runs it and we house it in our facilities, we're open to that, and it may be time for that. Community schools is similar. We run a community schools program, and for the community, we're not using that for our school programs. We're running it for community programs, and we have difficulty as well staffing this program. And
Dr.
so we
Weiss?
end up, yes.
Oh, could you just briefly explain to us what community schools is?
Oh, absolutely. So community schools is a program where we rent your facilities when we're not using them, right? So our schools are owned by the city. So during non-school hours, the community is able to use our facilities. And so you all support this program each year so that we can run this. We have monitors because we can't just have people in the buildings without any supervision. So we pay monitors to do that. We pay a person who does all the scheduling. We have to invoice people for these rentals. Often the auditoriums are, as an example, we rent those to the symphony. Well, one of the impacts this year is with Centennial Hall closing for renovation, we're getting a lot more requests than normal. So we're having a much higher load. Staffing is a challenge. And so we're having to use our staffing as an example administratively to run this program because we don't have a supervisor for this program. We can't fill that position. So it's pretty problematic, and it is more expensive than normal because of us trying to find monitors to be able to support the rentals.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And keep going.
Those are the key points, and then I can maybe answer specific questions.
Madam Chair, could I just follow up about the rally one?
Yeah.
Just to follow up on the rally one, I'm fuzzy on the years, but I recall multiple years ago, when we were doing the childcare thing and rally was a question, and who was going to still support rally, and there was supposedly an effort. I think you were going to analyze and try to figure it out, and I know a global pandemic got in the way, but we were sort of temporarily I don't know if it's temporarily, but funding rally while we figured it out. And are we any closer to figuring it out? Because it does, pretty expensive for the number of students, and here we are with another, $750,000.
Yes, we have actually we shrunk the program down to 3 sites to attempt to make it as cost effective as possible, and we were able to do that. And you're right, during the pandemic, the city, the assembly subsidized families. So you were able to do that with some of the dollars that you received, and I know that meant a lot to families. You subsidized their payments to assist those families during COVID. So we've shrunk the program back to make it cost effective for the most part. And we are hoping to expand because there is the need. So in order for us to expand, we, again, to staff it, the only way we can expand it is to pay our existing employees overtime to be in the after school work hours. And so we also have deficit that we're still eliminating. So the question Mayor Weldon asked about, is this recurring? These costs are not necessarily recurring costs. We're definitely repairing some deficit. And a few of the items are things that by asking now won't be on our list when we come to you in about a month with our FY24 budget.
Okay, we have Ms. Hughes-Gandes. Mayor Weldon, I saw your hand up, but you look like you've taken it down, and then Ms. Hale.
Thanks. Madam Chair, I have a question just because I have a couple of questions that are over the map. Should I just do one at a time and get back in line if they're not related? Is that?
Sure.
I'm gonna say yes, because I see Ms. Hale waiting behind me and I want to be polite. So, Dr. Weiss, you mentioned enrollment a few times, so I just want to make sure I'm clear on that or clarify that. When you projected enrollment last year for the current year, I know you have someone who does a forecast for you every year, I think Greg Erickson. Did you use the Greg Erickson forecast for that when you were projecting enrollment? And then I also think you already said this one, but just so I'm clear, was that over or under what the actuals were.
Thank you. Erickson does a report for us and does a range. So in his forecasting, he gives a low, a mid, and a high. So it's not an exact forecast. We were, from projected enrollment, we were 92 students down. From last year's enrollment actual to this year's actual enrollment, we were almost level. So we didn't lose a lot of students from last year to this year. So I think that's one distinction that is important, because it's easy to, when we talk about this enrollment thing, we think we lost 90 kids. We did not. Our enrollment was just about flat, moved around a little bit by grade level, but overall we were really close. But that number, the budget was built on 4313. And I'd have to look again to see what his mid-range was. I don't have that at the top of my head anymore, since it was last year's budgeting number, but I do know that our enrollment from last year to this year was very steady, and we were about 92 students shy. And again, because the formula is different now with the mill rate, that didn't change the local contribution at all, because it's not based on that exact enrollment number any longer.
And Madam Chair, just a quick follow-up, because I was writing.
Yes, but you muted yourself.
Yes, sorry. I was busy writing down the numbers. So we didn't use the mid. Did we use the high or the low?
I don't know off the top of my head. What I will try to find out here while we're talking, but I don't recall what his exact mid-range was. The board usually shoots for the mid-range of what Erickson's enrollment is. Sometimes they will make a decision to estimate a little more than that or a little under that. But we don't generally go with the low or the high. We usually start with the mid-range as the discussion point, and then the board will talk about that. And, and again, we're still coming out of our COVID reaction in terms of population and homeschool choices. So I think that this existing year right now, this school year, was sort of the last year of real wondering, like how many kids are still going to move around. I think going into next school year, we're still, the number of kindergarten students, as an example, was still a real wild card going into this school year. We had a lot of some 7-year-olds show up that had never been in school before. So there was still a lot of vulnerability because of those COVID years, where I think we're leveling out now. For FY24, I think enrollment will be a little more stable and as expected.
Okay, we'll have Ms. Hale and then Ms. Wall and then Ms. Huskandes. I'll put you back in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Sorensen and Superintendent Weiss for being here. I really appreciate it. I like Ms. Gladishevsky would really like. I guess I appreciate your explanations, but I too am having trouble connecting the dots. And I was actually shocked to see the community schools number, because I just hadn't realized it would be that expensive. One question I have about community schools is, where does that rental income go? Who gets the rental income? Does that go to the school district?
It funds part of the program. So and I could be wrong on that, but from my understanding, it is part of the operational. So it partly pays for itself. And again, this is one of those services that the school district has provided for quite a long time in terms of running this program. And I'm not sure that's sustainable anymore with the level of staffing that we have. In the old days, when we could have a supervisor, when we could have adequate staffing, and we were providing general oversight, that is a different thing. But it really, both programs have become fairly problematic in terms of us having enough staff to actually run the program. There's a community schools fund that those dollars go to, but I don't know exactly all the channel. I can certainly find that out for you. And Cassie Olin is here. We could pull her over and she could speak to that as well.
You know, I don't need all the details. I think the conversation is really interesting, and it almost does sound like, I mean, because I've taken community schools classes, and maybe it is time to sort of rethink that. There's a huge benefit to the community, but that's a lot of money. The other question I had was how many students are in Raleigh this year?
We have a waiting list. We have 4 sites, and we have a waiting list. Let me see. We have 175 students currently enrolled.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is probably a question for maybe both Mr. Manager and Dr. Weiss. I am hearing two different things here. I'm hearing, you know, we're not sure if these are eligible. And then I'm hearing these are the categories we've always been funding outside of the cap and there's a greater need in them. I certainly don't understand why those costs wouldn't be eligible if they're the same costs we've been funding every year.
Thank you, Ms. Wool. We certainly, they are eligible. You know, we wouldn't have, we believe they're eligible. We have no reason to think they are not. In our checking with DEED, they are. So we can certainly get something in writing, but these are the same eligible categories that we typically ask. The one different category is summer school. And so we double checked that with DEED. And based on a couple of criteria, it fits. There are a few things that you couldn't use it for. If we were going to do this as an example for all students, if we were going to say, we're going to do 1 extra week of all students, then that it wouldn't count. But because it is for a subset of our population and it is to support learning loss, then it's eligible.
Mr. Watt.
Thanks. So I think I was a little bit confused by the memo as well, because I thought these were FY23 costs, but Mr. Holst helpfully advises that these are debts from prior fiscal years, so from 22 and earlier. I don't know that we can resolve this today, but I think we need to clarify exactly what the money is for and get written confirmation from DEED that they're eligible. So debts from 22 and earlier requested mid-year in 23 as I now understand it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Watt. Ms. Euskandis, before we go back to you, I'm going to jump in. I don't know who this question would be for, Mr. Rogers, Dr. Weiss, Mr. Watt. If we wanted to move the functions of community schools to Parks and Rec, for instance, if we thought that maybe it would be better staffing wise and budget wise, how would we go about doing that? Who wants to
I
answer?
think that's probably a Rory question.
Mr. Watt.
Well, not a topic that I know a lot about, but I assume we would need to have an understanding on use of the facilities. And if on the city side, if we're going to take on a new program, it would require a budget and appropriation. So we can dig into that and look. And again, I guess exactly the same answer with regard to Raleigh. It's not, you know, the school district maintains their own budget system that's not readily transparent to us. So we would have to dig into that and just try to understand the ramifications.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Watt. And back to you, Ms. Euskandis.
If I can find the window, then I'll find the unmute button. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just, while we're talking about eligibility, I guess a thought or two before I have a question on Raleigh, but my understanding, the timing is actually kind of fortuitous because we just had a winter conference where we got to talk to other cities from around the state at the Alaska Municipal League. And with the chronic underfunding that the state's been doing, and the deficits that are occurring across the state, and the amount of lobbying that's been happening up on the Hill by educational groups and school districts from around the state, there were a group of municipalities that were gathered around to talk about their school districts. And as somebody who has funded above the cap for a while, I don't know how many years that goes back, you'd be surprised how many people were not aware that that is a thing, and they were shocked, like jaw dropped. I was just trying to find a comprehensive list, but I mean, I'd be interested to know how many school districts or how many municipalities do fund above the cap, because I find it to be, we could get something in writing from DEED, and that'd be interesting to me. But my understanding is that is like kind of a loose thing. I was just looking at what Sitka does for what they fund, that's considered above the cap. And some of the things that are considered above the cap for these other municipalities are things that Juneau already owns. So we couldn't count those. Like, we already own the pool. So taking care of the pool would not be, any help to the school district. But I certainly, for one, just sounds like Mr. Manager's already gathering information, but I really would want quite a comprehensive statement from DEED that's beyond that these categories are okay. I know these are historically these categories, but when I look back at the court cases in the state of Alaska regarding, why we have like a cap in the first place, I kind of don't see how we could just keep funding above the cap and have that be legal. Which leads me to a question, and I'll stop talking. You said, Dr. Weiss, I understand with the labor force, we have teachers doing Raleigh. I just want to clarify my understanding. If those are overtime hours, are those teachers teaching during the day? I'm getting head shakes.
If I can
Are you gonna go ahead
clarify,
and interrupt me?
this is a bit of a misnomer. I think this was a misconception. Another time we talked about this. These are not teachers. These are, as I said, classified personnel. So not certified teachers. These are classified staff. So these are our paraprofessionals. And so they are working overtime, but it's not certified teachers. So we don't have certified teachers working in Raleigh. There was a little bit of a misperception before that it was teachers, and that's what was driving up the cost of Raleigh. I can't remember where I saw or heard that, but I remember thinking, oh, wait, that's not quite right. So this is our classified personnel that we're speaking about.
Could you explain to me I apologize for my ignorance, but then what that really means when you say you're paraprofessionals, how that misconception is happening?
I don't know, but the term teacher has been used in a couple of conversations, and we do not have any teachers working in Raleigh. They're classified personnel that work for us full-time during the day and then work those hours after school. And based on our collective bargaining agreement, that kicks their total hours into overtime.
Right. And I understand that, but you just used the term paraprofessional or something like
Right.
that. And I'm curious what you're doing for you during the day.
Paraprofessionals are our classified staff that work with students during the day. They work with our special education population. And so they're added classified support during the school day.
So is another term for that, would I know them in the community as a para educator?
Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
That's the word I'm looking for.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I appreciate folks wanting to ask questions that we typically ask when getting requests for future funding about, programs like community schools or Rally. And I think those conversations, should happen at some point. But this request is about filling a deficit. And so my question is about timing here. You all are preparing your budget for next year. I saw the article about having to guess what the legislature is going to do in terms of base student allocation and making your budget decisions around that. I imagine that maybe you can tell me about the impacts of the decision that the Assembly has to make around supporting filling this deficit. I would assume knowing soon is going to help you, given all those balls that you're juggling to try to figure out what next year's budget looks like. What does the timeline look like on that for you all?
Yeah, I thank you. That's a really good question. That is one of our challenges with budgeting, and is that we are almost always in 3 fiscal years. We get on the edge like now where we're really in 2. We're in this current one, and then we're building our budget for FY24. And as the board grapples with those decisions and building a budget that they can then bring to you in short order, these are questions. There is always a lot of variables, but this will add, without these answers, it'll add more variables. And so what will happen is the board would have to proceed through their budgeting process and then come back again and have some of these requests inside of that request instead of now. Again, without knowing this, it's going to be a little challenging for them to tidy up that budget for FY24 in a way that they can present it to you. It is, again, these are our deficits. We're working really hard to ensure that as we look at the flow that we are getting prepared with these deficits so that we don't end up in a position like we did last year or last June. And again, using the most accurate information we have when we have it versus waiting and introducing more variables. And if it's okay, I would like to answer one other question that was brought up by Ms. Hughes-Scanling is that we submit our budget to the state every year. So that our final process, we build a budget, we come to you all, and then it runs through your approval. And then every year we submit that to DEED. It's a very distinct process. If something is not right on that budget when we present it, they would kick it back to us. So there's no mystery. DEED knows exactly what we do, how we do it, what codes that these categories are. So this is definitely approved on an annual basis by DEED. In fact, one year as an example, you'll remember, some of you or most of you will probably remember, we asked for help a number of years ago with the lease on the UAS Tech Center for our auto program. And you all approved, I think, $40,000 to help pay the rent on that facility for one of our CTE classes for the year. Well, we learned that year that wasn't an allowable expense. They said, wait, that's K-12 instruction. Even though it's this kind of abstract lease for a building, it is K-12 instruction that doesn't qualify. So we changed that. So that's an example where we, at that time, this was before my time as a superintendent, but that we thought that was eligible and it wasn't. And that just was part of the submission process when we discovered that.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. Ms. Gladaszewski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 2 things. One is the Rally issue. So Rally is the 2 adds up to 900,000, 175 students. That's, you know, almost $5,200 a student. So that's how much it costs to keep those students in Raleigh. That's how much the city is putting in to keep students in Raleigh. And we had a long conversation about childcare several years ago, and we had tables and how much various things cost, and I can't remember any of the tables. But in the context of that, I think that seems like a lot of money. So I don't know who and when we're ever going to get to that, but you know, I think we need to have a conversation about Raleigh, whether that's the best place to put almost $1 million. Should we do something else with it? So that's just the Raleigh question. And then the overall question I have is about how confident you are in your financial accounting. You know, my understanding is, you know, last year you spent more money than, I'm not exactly even sure what happened. Something wasn't good. And now there's a memo that says it's FY23, but then we just heard from Mr. Manager that it's not really FY23. It's really a bunch of old debts that you have. I don't even know if that's true, or it's kind of oral legend. So it's beginning to concern me that when we give the manager a budget, he never comes back, in all my experience, and says, I need $2.5 million more because I just do because I do. And I know it's extraordinary, but you know, COVID was awful. That's true. But anyway, are you sure about these amounts? And can you show us the backup for this stuff so that we're all confident that this is really real? Thanks.
I'm not sure if there was a question in there.
Yep, the question is, how
Yeah.
sure are you about these numbers?
Okay.
And can you show us the backup? Because there's been a lot of back and
Okay.
forth, and like I said, the manager doesn't come back and say, can I have $2.5 million more? Because I just have more expenses than I thought.
Mhm.
When I have a salary and I know how much money I get, my employer gives me a salary, and then, you know, if I overspend my salary, I can't just say my employer should pay me more money. It's my fault. So I'm trying to understand how confident you are in, you know, the analysis is my family budget. I know how much I need to spend on my electricity. If I don't have enough money to spend on my electricity, it's my fault.
Well, I certainly wish that our budgeting and our expenditures and our revenues were that simple. About the only thing that we're ever sure of is once we have our student enrollment is our revenue. That's fixed. We don't have any access to create revenue outside of, you know, our funding streams that we have through the state and through the local contribution. There are many, many variables. We have a hard winter, we have a less hard winter, utilities change, fuel changes. There are so many variables in what expenses occur. We're in the middle of negotiations right now. We don't know how exactly that's going to end up. That could be a cost, as an example, for this existing year that we have no way of exactly knowing. It just simply is complex. I want to assure you we're not here to ask, I don't know what phrase was used, but it felt a little negative. And so I want to say that we are here thoughtfully, respectfully asking for some support. The reason that this says FY23 is because that's how we view fiscal years. FY23 is the funding year that we were asking for these funds. When we come to you for our next budget request, that will be FY24 because we won't receive those funds until FY24. So the reason this request is categorized as an FY23 request is because we will be receiving the funds, whatever you approve, in FY23. And we wanted to make sure that it was clear that that was different than what we're asking for FY24. So that's some of the explanation for why it's a different why this is an FY23 request.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I have a couple questions. I think now I understand, and I do see in Ms. Sorensen's memo, the third paragraph talks about resolving current deficits. And so those are deficits and then including summer school for 200 for this year. But so those are deficits that came over from the prior fiscal year, as I understand it from Mr. Manager. I have two questions. One, the money identified by the audit, which I think was about 600,000, is that included in these figures? And my second question is are some of the uncertainties around COVID, do they play a factor in these deficits from last fiscal year that carried over?
Thank you very much for those questions. Yes, the Rally deficit is still impacted by those COVID years. We're working our way through that. One of the things that we committed to do that we did was reconstruct Rally by narrowing it down to 4 sites in order to make it solvent. But we can't make up for that residual deficit unless we pass that on to families. And again, we're trying to commit to that affordable, high quality childcare that we all have as a priority. So that debt was contributed from during those pandemic years. I think you had another question. Did I miss one of your questions?
Yeah, the money revealed the problem with, I think it was
yes,
revealed by the audit. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. No, that is not in this. Not included.
Ms. Huskianis.
Can't find the mute button tonight. Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have more questions. I do also want to acknowledge, Dr. Weiss, I appreciate that you don't have any control over your revenue. And that's like I mentioned, I appreciate that the state has a large role to play in this. So that is appreciated. And I do understand that you file your budget with DEED every year. And I appreciate that. It's just, I think this is something that for me personally, I can only speak of one of 9 people here. I want to make sure that our finance staff also thinks that's allowable. And I'm not sure to what degree they have information, but I don't think my question is for Dr. Weiss. I think my question is for Mr. Watt or Mr. Rogers. With it's really, I guess, to a certain extent important for me to understand. I understand perhaps school district is using different tracking for their fiscal year. It doesn't align neatly. They're tracking when they make the request. My understanding was, and I guess Mr. Rogers, correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but my understanding was that audit revealed that deficit, and that was also a deficit in the requirement of the charter that the school district needed to resolve within that year, and also gave them a heads up. You're also probably going to have a deficit in the next year too, so that they're, in addition to Ms. Wall brought up timing, yes, it's a very you don't want to be in their shoes. That as far as the timing of making their budgets, that in addition to making their budget and thinking about the requests that they're preparing to make, they need to resolve this deficit before this year is over. So could you talk about that a little bit, how that lines up with how we think about the fiscal years? Yeah, I guess my first question.
Yeah, I might reserve my comments. I don't want to wade into something that I don't particularly understand all that well either. The school district's financial statements are not my expertise. Ms. Tarver, our auditor, is still here. She might be a good person to bring into this if you want. That's one option. But just for clarification purposes, the school district does have the same fiscal year that we do. I mean, they're on a July 1st to June 30th fiscal year. And your comment is correct. The audit finding about the violation of the charter is specifically related to the school district spending money it didn't have. I mean, that's just quite straightforward. It's the same thing as having a deficit. The school district really, according to our charter, can't end with a fund level deficit. It just means they spent money that wasn't appropriated to them. And you're also correct that, if hindsight being 2020, the corrective action would have been for the school district to come forward and request supplemental funding for the prior fiscal year during the prior fiscal year, right? That would have comported with the charter. It would have included the assembly into that deficit, and that's what didn't happen here. I think I am understanding Dr. Weiss's approach and the board's approach, which is to request funding to answer prior deficits. That's making sense in my head. And Dr. Weiss is correct. Just as an artifact of the fact that we are now in FY23, that funding would come from the city to the school district in FY23. We can't go backward and put money back into FY22. So we just are where we are. I think your question remains relevant. If we solve, if the assembly chooses to use funds according to the school district's request to alleviate deficits from 22 and prior, are there, I think, a reasonable question, which I think you're asking, which is, do the same deficits exist in the current year? And I don't know the answer to that. I think Dr. Weiss may, but other than that, I think as it relates to the prior audit finding and to the exact conclusion on the financial statements for the prior year, Ms. Tarver is still on the call, and she's still working for you. So if you want to pitch that question to her, I think it would be appropriate.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rogers. That was helpful, that clarification. Ms. Jim, can I ask a quick follow-up or?
Quick follow-up.
Well, I'll get back in line. I guess it's not really a follow-up.
Okay. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Weiss, Ms. Sorensen for being here. Two questions, I guess, just to help me on this, and that's one, what would happen if you're not appropriated this money? And then two, the timing element. You talked about it some, but in our packet tonight, we have $5 million in requests or an ordinance or whatever. And yet I think it's been months since we've seen, updated sales tax information. And that's not a knock. The quarter hasn't come around. It hasn't ended, and it just hasn't happened yet. And of course, we're going into our budget season. So, we're trying to be a little more disciplined as assembly of putting things into the budget process. I guess I'm just curious, how soon do you need the funds? And I mean, does April work? Or anyway, could you talk to me about the timing of the receipt of funds and the necessity of them, and then the timing, and then the necessity of the timing of the receipt of funds? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Yes, we, again, as we are in this place of monitoring our existing budget and doing some things a little bit different, really making adjustments an extra time during the year in order to, again, real time ensure that we are on the mark, and that's the timely piece to this, that we really need that information, and helps us in our budgeting process when we come to you for FY24. When we if we don't get this support, then we'll do a couple of things. One would be, as we develop the final stages of our FY24 budget, some of this will be in that request and hoping to get that resolved then in the FY24 receipts. The other thing that will happen is we will have to start trying to stop this bleed of these community programs that we run, and in a timely way where we can, let our community know. We'd have to wrap that up by June 30th. We'd have to be looking for other options, working with the city to say, if you want this program to continue, then, your team would have to be working on ways to build that into your budget. So those would be some things that we would have to start doing.
Ms. Sorensen, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, as Dr. Weiss mentioned, the school district's mission is the K-12 mission, and we work very hard to support both ours and the city's embracing of high quality childcare and being able to help provide that. Same with making your buildings available to the community for all manner of community use. The other piece with the pupil transportation costs is, we as a community made a commitment a number of years ago because we didn't want, children walking down the middle of our roads because there's snow on the sidewalks for a mile to get to school. Well, we're running these transportation deficits because we made a commitment to bus children for a half mile or more to their schools. So with all of these things that we are looking at that are on these pieces, they are things that we have worked towards in order to support what we all want for our community.
Okay, Ms. Euskandis, this is your last question, and then Mr. Bryson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Dr. Weiss and Ms. Sorensen for being here. Ms. Sorensen, my last one is for you. It's, I guess, just a different way of phrasing and hopefully shaping it in a way to get the information I want or get the fullest information. How far along is the board in discussion right now? How much have you discussed alternatives if you don't get these funds? Ms. Weiss spoke broadly about, putting some of that in 24 and cutting out the bleeding. How detailed have those conversations been, and where are you at in those?
We have not spent an exceptional amount of time on these. We spent a bunch of time trying to decide whether or not we were going to make this ask of the assembly, which is why it came substantially later. And so, we spent a lot of time pondering over that. Most of our budgetary discussions have been how much we need to cut in order to deal with the structural deficit. So we have spent hours and hours and hours on many days figuring out what to cut, not what to add, just what to cut. So we've been wrangling over how big class sizes would be. We haven't really been spending quality time on this issue.
until we need to.
The other piece I would just add to that, what Dee Dee said, is that the conversation the board is having as well is around these deficits, because there are a few choices. One is that we continue to carry those deficits, which then plays out in potential June 30th audits, because those deficits are recognized on those books and increase the chances that, as this past year, we could be $60,000 off in a $90 million budget. But that can happen because you're carrying these deficits. So that's one choice the board has to make. Do we carry these, or do we use K-12 instructional dollars to get those paid off and then cut more K-12 instructional dollars to make that money available to take care of those deficits? So that's the other layer that the board has been grappling with.
Mr. Bryson. Last but not least.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was hoping, listening to Dr. Weiss and Ms. Sorensen tonight, come and tell us something that was going to make me feel comfortable with the predicament that we're in. And unfortunately, I have not heard it. It is the same song that has been presented to the Assembly 4 years in a row. Woe is us. We don't have enough money. We can't pay. We can't afford to do all the things we want to do. We've mentioned things, or I've even heard tonight that they would go back and I think Dr. Weiss said they would go and look at how they could stop the bleeding on something like community schools. Why has that not happened yet? If you know where significant bleeding is happening, for lack of a better term, where you don't have control over your budget, that's our biggest complaint about the school district, is control over budget. And so if you know that there's spots that are losing money, bring it to our attention so that we can do something about it, instead of handing us a bill at the end and asking us to reward poor budgeting practices. And forgive me for being harsh, but if we fund this year, the next time the school district finds themselves in less than strict budgeting practices and find themselves in the same position, they're going to come back to us, and we're just going to be the easy answer on how to fix the school district's budget.
Mr. Bryson, is there a question in there?
Well, I think that's the main question. If we know that there's significant loss in some programs, why has that not been brought to the Assembly? Man, there's like 100 more things I want to say, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the time, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson.
A couple of things that I would just like to say, if that's okay, Ms. Treem. You know, we are, I just spent for the last 72 hours up on the Hill advocating for school funding. It's going to be an intense session. There's a lot of activity there, and many education bills, and there are many friends and supporters of education there. There are also many who do not believe that education should have, K-12 education should have an increase. So there's some mixed opinion there. I would hope that all of you would join the board and join me in doing that advocacy, because it's critical. There isn't anything that lights me up in a day saying I get to go to the Assembly tonight and ask for money. There is nothing in my day that makes that feel like a good thing to come do. But we are in a predicament. Every time I get a chance to speak publicly, if you hear me on Action Line, if you hear me presenting at a Rotary, in board meetings, I continually, as the board does, recognize the Assembly for their commitment to education. We, as a school district, monitor our budget. We are audited by the same company that just presented to you tonight your budget finding, your audit findings. This isn't about bad budgeting. It isn't about bad spending. This is about K-12 education being underfunded, drastically underfunded. There has been zero increase to the BSA in 7 years. Transportation funding, again, is the same today as it was the day school started in the school year 15-16. And we all know what inflation has done. I can't express enough how appreciative we are that you are partners and that together the school board and you provide a high quality educational experience in our community. We can't do it without you, and we want to do it with you. But our financial predicament is due to a lack of funding from the state level and regressive funding because of the flat BSA. We have a real shot this year at maybe getting the $30 increase that they have scheduled for FY24 means a total of $238,000 for our district. So that's what that equates to. The increase that they have in the Alaska Reads Act means $238,000 more dollars for next school year than we had for this school year. Doesn't even cover the backdrop of the one-time funding they gave us for this year. So we don't even get back to even. So again, I just really want to I want to express gratitude because you have been incredibly generous and it makes a huge difference in this community. And B, I just have to say that we are doing our work as a school district with one hand tied behind our back. And finally, I think the state is beginning to recognize that they have to commit, like you have committed, the state has to commit to K-12 education. And we might get somewhere this year. But our predicament is not about bad numbers and it is not about bad budgeting. It is about being put in a fiscally vulnerable situation by the state of Alaska.
Thank you, Dr. Weiss. I think we all recognize that. As we wrap up, I just want to reiterate, before we can appropriate anything, obviously this is the Finance Committee, we can't do that tonight. I think there is a need and a want for more information, and if you could bring that back to us, and I will just give you an example. So in the FY21 school district budget, community schools had a fund balance of $400,000. In the information we got last year from the school district, FY22 was community schools budget was $95,000, same in FY23. That doesn't add up to a $226,000 deficit. So if we could see how that happens, and the same for all these other things on your list here, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Before we are going to take action on this. Mayor Walden.
I think you were wrapping up what I was just gonna say, but one thing that we could probably look at doing as assembly, besides getting more information from the school district, thank you for that, is we should probably figure out a way that we're gonna advocate for the BSA increase. I don't know if everybody's following that, but there is a House bill and a Senate bill. Never remember which one's for the 1,000 and which one's for the 1,250, but that's something we probably want to put on our plates too. So anyway, again, thank you guys for coming tonight, and we'll wait for some information.
Sure.
Thank you, Mayor Weldon.
Ms.
Thank you.
Wall.
Oops, thank you, Madam Chair. I know folks need more information, and thank you, Ms. Treem, for spelling out what you're looking for. But given the timeline that the school board is on to be creating their budget, I would suggest we introduce an ordinance, and so that we get this on track for them having an answer. So I would just make a motion that the Finance Committee forward an ordinance of appropriating $2,540,737 to the Assembly for introduction. And I ask for unanimous consent.
Ms. Gladaszewski.
Oh, I had a question,
Okay.
but this motion is now, how do
Okay.
you want to? My question, yeah, isn't about the motion.
Okay, get back to you. I saw some hands come up as the motion was made. Mayor Weldon.
I understand Ms. Wall's trying to get things through faster, but until they dive down into the numbers, once you do an appropriation ordinance, you can't change the number. So we can hold a special assembly meeting attached to one of our other ones if we have to introduce it sooner. So at this time, until we get the numbers, I'm not comfortable voting for it, so I'd object.
Mr. Bryson.
Madam Chair, I too will object. I would like a lot more information, especially on programs that are knowingly losing money that we might be able to help in a different way, like community schools. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Ms. Treem. I meant to say up to that amount, recognizing that we can reduce the amount in the future, and that would be coming from general funds.
Okay. Okay, heard the motion. Mayor Walden and Mr. Bryson, you still have objection? Mayor Walden,
I'll remove my objection with the up to.
okay. Mr. Bryson, maintaining your objection? Okay. Okay, so we have a motion and we have objection. Ms. Spiegel, are you ready?
Thank you, Chair Trim, yes.
Okay, if you will call our roll, please.
On the motion to forward an ordinance for up to $2,540,737 to the full assembly funded by general funds. Assemblymember Wall,
Yes.
Assemblymember Bryson,
No.
Assemblymember Hughes Standy,
No.
Assemblymember Bucklaw Godok,
Yes.
Assemblymember Hale,
Yes.
Assemblymember Gladys
No.
Assemblymember Smith,
Yes.
Mayor Weldon,
Yes.
Chair Trim.
Yes,
Motion passes 6 ayes, 3 nays.
thank you. Ms. Gladczewski, did you have a quick
I did
question?
Yeah, just a quick one. I totally agree with the mayor about advocating for BSA, and did Dr. Weiss, did you say that $1,000, how much would that mean for, did you say it was, well, how much does it mean for the school district?
Yeah, the 30, what I, excuse me, what I did say was that what has been put in statute is the $30 increase for the BSA for next, for FY24, and that equates to $238,000 is all that is. The bills, you know, I can't predict. I would never, Mr. Smith could probably is breaking out in hives thinking about it. Never could I predict how this thing is going to shake out. What we're guaranteed basically at this point is the $30. There are bills in for higher. Your advocacy would be so greatly appreciated. And I think it's very appropriate when you all are responsible for many, many community programs, and the K-12 education is one of them. And when everything that you commit to us is something you're not committing somewhere else, right? And so the state needs to do their due diligence so that the burden does not fall on the local government. And so it really is, I think, a very, very good vantage point for you all to be advocating, as well as you, the assembly, and we, the district and the school board, have all really common goals, you know, about what kind of program delivery we want to contribute here in Juneau.
Yeah, I don't think you get any argument about, you know, lobbying for increase in the BSA, but you have like how many students? So it would be like, you have like 4,000 students, is that something like that?
Right, correct.
So like
Yep,
$4
just over
million.
4,000. So yep.
If the big one happens. Okay, that's all.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
thought
Yep.
you said, I got all nervous when you said.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And Ms. Sorensen.
Yes, I would just like to thank the Assembly for their continued support. And I too have spent time on the Hill. It's far from a done deal. So, I mean, we're all hopeful, but you know, if nothing happens, then it is going to be a bitter year next year. I mean, the state was willing to pass the Alaska Reads Act, but the amount of money, that $30, wouldn't even start to cover the cost of the reading teachers that they would be expecting us to have. So, I mean, it's essentially an unfunded mandate too. So I really hope, I know that the city actually has a lobbyist, so I really hope that, you know, the BSA is on his to-do list. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sorensen. Thank you, Dr. Weiss. Thank you to all the school board
Thank
members
you.
who I see have been listening closely. We appreciate you being here tonight. And we will
Thank you
take,
very much for your time.
yeah, we will take a 10-minute break and come back at 8:23. Okay, we'll come back to order. The next item on our agenda is the impact of school consolidation on state funding, and I think Mr. Rogers will kick this off, and we'll leave this at a high level because I hear that Chair Hale is going to do a deeper dive in the Joint School Facilities Committee. So, Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, thank you. So I've been asked by several members to help folks understand how the state funding formula works. It is indeed quite complex, or not complex, just many steps. Ultimately at the end of the day, it's math. It's a formula like any other. I've attempted in the memo to show you how that math works and to come up with, at best I understand, a calculation of how much the school district would lose in state funding from the closure of a high school, a middle school, or an elementary school. And when I say closure, I really mean that those students would be consolidated into other schools. So I think that I'll leave it there. It looks like we see numbers that say if we consolidated the two high schools, we would lose something on the order of $1 million, and if we consolidated a middle school into the others, we would lose something north of 700,000. And if we consolidated an elementary school into the others, we would lose something in the range of 500,000. Obviously, that's just one part of the analysis. Obviously, the school district and others would need, policymakers generally would need to think about the costs that would be saved by closing a school and what the other purposes of that facility would be. And it would be a much more complex overall consideration, but I'm just making an effort to help people understand the math of the school foundation formula, especially as it relates to the concept of school consolidation. So I appreciated that Dr. Weiss did note that the ground has shifted a little bit because the local contribution amounts, both up to the cap, or both the minimum local required and up to the cap amounts, are now totally set by our assessed valuation. So student counts and the remainder of the formula don't actually impact that. So school closure has no impact on the amount of local funding that the city of Borough Juneau can give to the school district. And and then also the note which Dr. Weiss alerted me to, which is a step down formula, and it's also in the document I sent you about the formula, but a step down process where school consolidation doesn't result in that loss of funding in the first year. It happens over 4 years before it's fully phased in. So I'm happy to take questions, but otherwise I do think it makes sense for someone else to pick this up and make sense of it.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Ms. Hale. Oh, you're muted.
I undo the hand and then I forget to unmute myself. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rogers, for introducing this. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows that we have a joint school board assembly facilities committee, and this kind of information is exactly what we're looking at. And we're looking at it, we're trying, and this is very helpful, and I really appreciate your doing this. And I know the school district and school board will look closely at this, but we're really looking at this in the overall context, and really what this committee is trying to do. And we've only met once so far, but what we're really trying to do is understand what the matrix would be, like what are the factors that would go into making a decision like consolidating schools. And Dr. Weiss is part of that meeting, or that group of people meeting, and she talked about, well, we also have to talk about things like our values, right? So we have facility costs and we pay the facility costs. We have the money that comes from the state. We have maintenance costs. So there's a lot that goes into a decision like that. And that committee is, we're looking at those factors. Our next committee meeting is April 13th, noon to 1:30.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is for Mr. Rogers. What would be the impact if the square footage component of the formula was gone? I did hear that that was part of what was preventing them from closing a school. So I made sure that both the governor and lieutenant governor and chief of staff, everybody up at Capitol Hill, Senator Keel's aware of it. So there's real work being done at looking at removing the square footage component of the BSA. How would that impact everything? Would we have then different criteria that we would be able to look at for closing a school? I would hope it would make it a little bit easier. If you could maybe explain what some of the consequences of just that line being removed, and then maybe this conversation could be more helpful for the state as they put that component in during a time when they were trying to grow schools, and now they know we're facing a different situation. I'm sorry, I've rambled on too much about it. If you could explain that, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. So Chair Treem, I'm unaware of any calculation of square footage in the formula itself. The way the formula starts is by adjusting ADM, which is a term of art for students, adjusting the number of students in an interestingly complicated way that advantages districts with more smaller schools. So it's not necessarily about the number of square feet in any given school building. It's about the basic background concept is that more schools with fewer students would result in more state funding than fewer schools, each with proportionally more students. So it is obviously, I think that we can understand that the formula was designed to assist very small schools. But when you have a school district with multiple school facilities, you wind up losing state funding when you consolidate schools, irrespective of whether that might be a policy aim or an objective. You do lose state funding. But I'm unaware of any part of the formula that relates directly to the square footage of facilities rather than just the existence of a school facility itself.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Rogers, just to make sure that I'm understanding your memo, these numbers halfway down the page in red, in parentheses, that is just what we would lose in state funding. That is not, we haven't looked at what would be the savings or the reduction in spending by closing a school of this type. So this is just lost revenue.
Assemblymember Smith, through the chair, that's correct. This only looks at lost funding. It doesn't look at any potential savings of consolidating a school and no longer operating the school.
Okay. And then for whoever, do those numbers exist yet, or is that potentially something that Ms. Hale's committee will look at, or anyway?
I have not asked the school district for those numbers. Obviously, it would take quite an analysis to determine what costs could be saved. I mean, we could all make sort of, things about an elementary school. We could obviously understand that they would no longer pay for electricity and custodial and maintenance, and to some degree, as students move, some portion of those costs would move also. But obviously, there are economies of scale, so not all of those costs move with students. You might have fewer administrative staff or executive staff. I mean, there are costs that would inevitably go away as a result of school consolidation, and a portion of those costs, I assume, would go with the students to other facilities. That's the analysis that the school district would need to complete. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Gladszewski.
Yeah, I would just say that there is a whole committee that's working on this, and if anybody has questions or wants to come, I mean, whatever date Ms. Hale said the meeting was, I happen to be on that committee. It's way more complicated than just, this is what we, miss in the formula. There's maintenance, there's, upgrades to schools, there's principal, anyway, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot, and that conversation really will be dug into at the Ms. Hale's committee on April, whatever she said, April
April
something.
13th,
April 13th.
12 o'clock. Is that what you said?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Any other kind of high level questions about this tonight? Okay, April 13th, 12 o'clock is the Joint Facilities Committee. Okay, so thank you for this, Mr. Rudders. And we will move on, and Ms. Hale will be tackling this topic in more depth. Okay, our next agenda topic is presentation on the short-term rental data, and we have Ms. Costick here to give us a presentation. And I would just ask that we hold our questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll get to go wild asking those questions. So, Ms. Costick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Treem. And I think Ms. Spiegel is going to share my presentation for me. Thank you. Okay, so for the record, Ruth Costick, I'm CBJ's revenue officer, and among other things, I supervise the sales tax office. This last summer, the Assembly appropriated funds for us to engage a contractor to do some data collection on short-term rentals in Juneau. That contract was finalized in late October. Our contractor, Harmari, collects data from over 80 websites where short-term rentals may be listed. They scrape the sites 4 times per week at staggered times, weekdays, weekends, daytimes, evenings, to try and catch the most listings. And then they use the information they get to try and match the listings to specific addresses, owners, and CBJ parcels. So I'm gonna, in this presentation, I'm gonna start by talking through some of the data we have so far, and then spend some time talking through some of the challenges we have with that data. Next slide, please. And I'm gonna try and talk quickly because I know it's been a long meeting for everybody. So, so this first slide is just a high-level overview of the short-term rental data, and this data was pulled down from our contractor on February 20th. I will note that these numbers do include duplicate listings, and I'll talk a little bit more about duplicate listings, but for now I'll just try to point out when the data does and doesn't include those duplicates. The numbers on the slide in particular that I wanted to highlight are towards the top, the numbers showing how listings have been added in the last year, 90 days, and 30 days. We'll look at a growth chart later, a longer term growth chart, but you can really see here there's been a lot of growth in short-term rentals in the last year with the Ironman bump, and we've continued to have slower but steady growth since then. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing it's a more select data set. It does exclude duplicate listings, and it's just looking at listings that have bookings already in the next 6 months. It's looking at average prices, both an average rate and a maximum rate for these different property types. I did want to note that those boat numbers, which look crazy, are a little skewed. There are only 2 boats that are listed, one of which is a liveaboard at $90 per night. The other one is a yacht that is a charter at $10,000 per week. So take those with a grain of salt. This average rate price is based on the current prices that are listed when the data was scraped off of the short-term rental sites. So it doesn't necessarily represent peak season pricing or average pricing across the year. I'm very curious to watch and see how some of these numbers might change as we get into the summer season. Next slide, please. This slide, the data also excludes duplicates. I think so. The chart on the left is showing us where we've got different property types. They kind of, I know might be a little hard to see, but biggest pie there at 192 is apartments, and then 164 houses, rooms at 32, and so on down the list. And then in connection with the chart on the right, where we've got a breakdown of entire houses versus private rooms and some other types of room types or listing types. I think the big takeaway here is that the vast majority of our listings in Juneau are really apartments, houses, similar types of domiciles, and they're really renting that entire property, not just a bedroom. Really renting a bedroom in a house is much less frequent. Next slide, please. This is just some interesting data on what sites are being used in Juneau. Airbnb is obviously the big player out there, but they're not the only one. I've just learned about HipCamp, which if you want to camp, that's the place to go apparently. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a heat map of where listings are located within Juneau. You can see the highest concentrations are really downtown Douglas and in the Mendenhall Valley, although there are some other outlying spots of red and smaller groupings like that. We do have access to a live version of this where you can zoom in on certain areas. If there's interest, Assembly members can reach out to Mr. Rogers or myself to get a tour of that. And this does include duplicate listings. Next slide, please. And then this is a chart. This comes from our contractor. It's looking at a longer view of, like I said, of how short-term rental listings have changed. It starts late 2019 through this last month on the 20th when I pulled the data. Again, slow growth up before kind of the Ironman bump there. You know, I was curious to watch and see post Ironman, especially once the cancellation, if we'd start to see some of that tick back down, but we haven't really seen that play out in the numbers just yet. So it's actually still growing. Next slide, please. Okay, so for the next several slides, I'm going to hit on some of the challenges we have with the data that I just presented and some things to be mindful of when you're considering the numbers on these previous slides. And I think the most important thing to understand is that this data is very dynamic. It's always moving as listings come and go. As I mentioned, Harmari is sweeping the various sites multiple times per week. There are operators out there that are actively trying to avoid detection by people like us to avoid regulation. We also, you know, we really don't get data for inactive listings. So if we're wanting to understand historically what happened, like on the first side where I pulled some information based on room bookings for the last year, that didn't include any of the inactive listings that, you know, may have been rented for a week in August for Ironman, but then got taken down. Next slide, please. So duplicate listings, these are listings where the same property is listed multiple times, either on the same site or across multiple platforms. They really create a lot of noise in the data. It's difficult to account for in some places. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand how they were impacting the data, and it's a struggle. The contractor does their best to identify duplicates, but it's not always clear. You know, for example, you might have a property where you've got a house that also has an accessory apartment, and both are listed out and they're listed separately. But from the contractor's perspective, it appears to be the same building. You know, it's the same spot, it's the same property, so they might pull it as a duplicate instead of as two different listings. And then that matters with how we want to use that data and how we want to think about those units. If we want to consider them as one property or one house, or we want to think about it as two separate units. And then there's, you know, I note on here 173 duplicate listings. There's another 65 presumed duplicate listings. when I exclude duplicates from the data, I'm not excluding the presumed duplicates that we haven't confirmed yet. So again, that creates noise in the data. Next slide, please. So this is just one extreme example of some of the noise with the duplicate data. This is a scenario where, you know, we've got multiple properties that have multiple, each of which have multiple units. The entire house is listed. The individual units are listed. They're all listed 4 or 5 times. It's really hard to pick these apart and understand what's truly out there and what is this inventory that we're looking at and trying to consider. It's also hard to pick this apart for sales tax purposes as well sometimes. Next slide, please. So non-short-term rentals, there's stuff out there that you know, we don't really consider as a short-term rental, and I don't think are the purpose of this conversation. So places where the stay is 30-day minimum, so they're really a longer-term rental. Hotel taxes cut off at 30 days. Things like campgrounds. The Forest Service cabins, Federal Forest Service cabins, are listed on HipCamp. And so they get pulled into our data, even though they're not really what we want to look at for the purposes of our short-term rental analysis. Next slide, please. So, and then with all of this, we have the added complication of just people being people and being inconsistent with how they name things or classify something. Or maybe they mistakenly list their property as a 2-bedroom on one site and they list it as a 4-bedroom on a different platform. You know, and the different platforms call out very different things depending on their format. And we've got, you know, hosts who are trying to market, and so I'm going to call my, you know, my listing a guest suite. Well, what does a guest suite mean? Is it an apartment? Is it a private room with an ensuite bathroom? Like, it's hard to kind of dig through the raw data and get to something that's more consistent. You know, so back in the previous slide where I showed the different property types, I only had about a dozen different property types there. That was a lot of me cleaning the data and making some choices because we had 38 different property types. And, you know, trying to decide, well, everything that looks like it might be a house, I'm going to call a house, because what's the difference between a house and a home and a farmhouse and a cottage? And how does that play into the getting us good usable information to understand what the inventory is out there? Next slide, please. This is just a really good example of inconsistent data. And this happens to be the same listing on 2 different sites, same property, I should say, listed on 2 different sites. The one on the left is the Airbnb listing. The one on the right is the VRBO listing. The one on the left, you can see Airbnb pointed out, calls it a private room in a bed and breakfast. It says it's a 1-bedroom, 1 bath. It also notes that it allows for 8 guests. So how you're going to fit 8 people in 1 bedroom, I'd like to know. The VRBO listing on the right is identified as a 4-bedroom, 4 bath. Says there are 6 beds in these 4 bedrooms, and yet it only sleeps 3. You know, and so our contractor, when they're pulling and looking at these different sites, they classified the Airbnb listing as a private room, VRBO listing as an entire house. They have different amounts of bedrooms counted, different capacities counted. And so when we're trying to look at duplicates, well, which one do we count? It's clearly a large house with multiple private rooms in it, but that's not always readily clear from how they list it on their websites. So all this is to say, the data is only good as what goes in. Next slide, please. Sales tax compliance. This is a important part thing for me, of course, and I was pleasantly surprised that out of close to 600 listings, we only sent 103 first letters in our first round of compliance checking up. So that's pretty good, much better than I anticipated. Some of those we've gotten registered. Several got taken down. Some we were able to match with existing sales tax accounts, but it's not easy because some of these properties, well, take a step back. We don't always collect an address for the sales tax accounts, a physical address. We might have a merchant who has more than one property, so it's harder to match it. They might list, they might have more than one line of business, and we have them in our database as a carpenter, but they are now doing short-term rentals on the side under the same business license and sales tax account, and so they didn't get pulled in our short-term rental list. It can be difficult to match some of these up, and so we were, so some of these people got letters and called and said, hey, I have an account, I'm good. Next slide, please. Okay, in addition with the sales tax, we've got super hosts. We've got some of these folks, property managers who have dozens of properties that they're running, and they may not use consistent names or consistent business names in their hosts. So, you know, as an example, as a made up example, John Smith has a company called J. Smith Enterprises. That's his property management company. And he's, depending on when he's added listings for clients, he might have them listed under John Smith, under J. Smith, under J. Smith Enterprises as the host name. And it's really challenging to try and figure out from a sales tax perspective. Thankfully, Juneau's a small town. I'm like, oh yeah, there's Mr. Smith. I know that that's all him. The contractor doesn't know that. And so that's extra work that we have to do to try and match that up. The other thing I want to point out is ghost listings. This is something we ran into a lot with our first round of lettering, is hearing from people who said, well, I closed my Airbnb listing down years ago. What do you mean? And it's like, well, no, it's actually still out there. You just blocked all the dates, but it's still active. So we've got these listings out there that are considered active, but they're just kind of ghosting out there. That's going to mess a little bit with our capacity data or occupancy data, because all of those blocked dates, the only thing that we assume is that those are booked dates. We don't know that they're just all blocked. So those may look like booked dates that aren't really booked. So again, it's creating about a lot of noise out there. We've heard from several operators who were confused. They thought Airbnb was collecting sales tax for them. They don't know what the rules are. They don't understand it. They end up paying a lot in late fees because they've been operating for a year and they didn't figure out. So no one told them because that's their responsibility. But it's really hard and for them, and it's hard to work with them sometimes to get them into compliance, and they're frustrated. We have at least 3 known national companies that are operating in Juneau that are managing short-term rentals on behalf of customers. One of them is Evolve. You'll see them, and you saw them back on the platform page back there, because they also list on their own site. They list on Airbnb and other sites for customers. They do everything from manage the interactions with guests, hire cleaning crews to turn over properties, stock toilet paper and coffee pods and all those things. So, and then again, that just adds more complication with sales tax. Next slide, please. So these last few slides are just really going to touch on some of the benefits that we can get from registering short-term rentals in Juneau. Short-term rental registration is really common in other jurisdictions. It's something we're seeing more and more. In other jurisdictions, the new thing and the new best practice is not just registering them, but requiring with that registration that you display your permit or license number in your listing online. And part of that is it means when you do that, and then you've got your company like Harmari that's doing those scrapes and looking at the data, they can very quickly say who's in compliance and who's not. Next slide, please. And just to that point, in the little graphic in the corner that's really tiny and hard to see, that's actually a Harmari chart that they give us on their dashboard. That's the permit numbers displayed on listings. And you notice that all of ours are in the none displayed category. So we can, with registration, with registering short-term rentals, we can collect good information, consistent information, so that we have a quality inventory of things like property type, number of bedrooms, where the locations are. It makes it easier for us to ensure people are getting compliance with sales tax, because we can tie them to an existing sales tax account or make sure that they understand what their sales tax requirements are and give them good information to help keep them in compliance right away. And again, this comes with also with displaying the permit so that it's easier to do this compliance quickly at a glance going forward. And next slide. And just finally, registration also sets the city up to be able to address some potential issues down the road for CDD, if they want to do some monitoring for housing and zoning compliance, making sure that somewhere where someone's operating a short-term rental is actually a proper housing unit. Do they have a legal bedroom in there? Does it have an egress? Things like that. A lot of other jurisdictions require regular safety inspections or fire inspections, just like you would a commercial hotel. There are other things our contractor already flags, when they see things like on that example I showed earlier, 1 bedroom, but the maximum capacity is 8. Like, that's a red flag. Hey, how are you putting 8 people in 1 bedroom? That seems like it might be a zoning violation, or a housing code violation. We can also help ensure that owners are aware that their properties are being listed. I did come across one owner when we sent our letters out where their long-term tenant had rented out their apartment or their house without their knowledge on Airbnb. And then, that last point, I don't think that we have a problem in Juneau with party houses like some of the bigger vacation destinations do, at least not that I'm aware of. But if things like that start to be a concern, having that registration just makes it a little easier for us to, as a city, help respond to problems like that. And that's the end of my presentation. I went very quickly, so I appreciate if there are questions.
That was great. Who has questions? We'll start with Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to start it off, I should disclose that in the past and planned in the future that I have done short-term rentals at my home, but I've been advised by the city attorney that because it's general enough in nature that it's not something I have to recuse myself from. I guess just a quick question from Ms. Kostick. Thank you very much for the presentation, by the way. That was great. I mean, obviously there's a lot of noise in the data, but looking at page 2 of your presentation, where it says 577 short-term rental active and intermittent listings in Juneau. Again, knowing there's complications in data, I mean, is that like the best? Is that what our best guess is?
Good question. That is, I mean, that is on the day that I pulled that data, there were 577 active listings. I looked at the dashboard this morning, there were 584. That's a moving target because the number of listings, it's the intermittent listings in particular, those people who are pulling their listings down during certain times of the day to try and avoid detection, and stuff, where you're going to get some of that movement in particular.
Yeah, and just Madam Chair, just a quick follow up, and that was, and the data also show that the vast majority of those listings, and we're realizing that's, there's, I don't know, like a box in West. Anyway, there is noise in that number, but the vast majority of them were full house or full apartment, full home type rentals or listings. Okay.
Yes, Mr. Smith, that is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I have Ms. Wall, then Ms. Gladys-Shevsky, then Mayor Walden.
Thank you. I was hoping we could pull up that trend slide again, and then I've got a question on that. And this is kind of a follow-up on Mr. Smith's questions, just making sure I understand the data.
I think just a couple down. Sorry.
That
There.
one. Yes. Okay. So, when Ironman's announced, we kind of slowly see some upticks, and then around the time that people are really housing people, we see a big, for Ironman, kind of jump, and then it continues to increase. And so, if we had a significant number of people who were like, this one time I'm going to get on Airbnb, I'm going to do the work, I'm going to get on there, and then, but we don't see a drop, is that because they just like their places, they're still in they're still in Airbnb's system somewhere, they're like, maybe someday I'll do this again, even if they're not like actively looking for people? Is that, I'm just surprised that it wouldn't have kind of gone down. Am I correctly understanding why it didn't go down after those people who did it for one weekend stopped renting out their house?
Thank you, through the chair. It's a great question. I think like you, I expected to see a drop post Ironman, especially once it was canceled for the following year. And we haven't seen that play out in the numbers. It's hard to know. I can't read minds. I think that there are some number of listings that are ghosting out there. Like you said, they got in the system, they rented it for that week in August, and then they've either they blocked all the rest of the dates and they forgot about it, or they don't know how to take it down, or they thought they took it down. Some of them did it for the first time with Ironman and said, wow, that's easy and I made a lot of money. And now I'm going to keep doing this because I can make more money doing this than I can renting it out on a monthly basis. So I think there's probably a mix of those two things, and what that looks like in reality, like, I don't know what that mix is, and we don't have that in our data.
Just quick, thank you, that's helpful. Just quick follow-up. And you mentioned something about occupancy, like you have that, you said that was noisy, but you've got information, the contractor provides information on like how many of these places are actually getting booked.
Yes, through the chair. Yeah, there's we have, and there was one number I did throw on that first slide, that high level overview, that said the number of booked days in 2022 from the active listings, and there's 50,595 booked days. But that's really but that includes, or might include, some of these listings where all the dates are blocked and our assumption is those are booked. And that person's a really super duper like marketer of their Airbnb. And some of that might be true. Or it could be that they've blocked all the days because they really don't want to rent it out anymore.
Ms. Gladszewski.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I had some of the similar questions about that, the blue, if you go back to the blue bar graph thing. As in, what does listings versus bookings mean? So I too am the same befuddlement about Iron Man. I would have thought it went down. So those things on, January 2023, that it's over 500 on your graph. That means there's a property listed to be available on January 1, 2023, or what does a listing mean? And then you mentioned bookings. So you assume that if there's blocked out dates, it's booked. I'm just trying to understand what the data mean. Yeah.
Very good question through the chair. Yes, so a listing, when the term listing refers to a posting on Airbnb. There is a property that is advertised on Airbnb, for example, or one of the other sites that is up there that when you search Juneau, Alaska, you're going to get a property that is, whatever in Juneau. You can look at that property and you'll get a little calendar of availability. And the bookings are when that calendar is unavailable. We assume, or we or the contractor assume, that if it's unavailable, it's booked. That's why it's unavailable. And so when it's available, those are open days that are not booked. So bookings are assumed days that a room is booked, and a listing is just the property itself advertised on on one of the various platforms.
Okay, so just all of those Ironman that increase, they're all still there, but we don't know whether they're actually being rented, really, right? That's kind of what you're saying.
That is correct.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Mayor Weldon. Mayor Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, I'm in trouble finding the button. So I guess my question is, do you have any sense of how many of these are people in their home renting out their home occasionally versus, you mentioned a couple companies that are actually renting out several units? Do you have a sense of any of that split, or is it too hard to get out of the data?
Through the chair, Mayor Weldon, some of that, we can see some of that in the data, and the contractor is able to somewhat identify for us. We call those super hosts, hosts who have more than, I think they classify it as more than 5 listings under their name. Where it gets some of the challenge, though, we have is, like in my example with Mr. Smith, that's based on a real example of a person who has multiple listings, some of which are, the host is listed as their business, some of it is listed as their current name, some of it's listed as their former maiden name. It all depends on what time, when they happen to add the listing and what name they remembered to put down when they added it. And so it's harder sometimes to catch those super hosts who are really doing that bigger property management, as opposed to someone in their home or renting out their home occasionally, or doing a personal rental. Evolve is an easy one as one of the corporate super hosts or third-party management companies out there, because they're very clear in identifying Evolve as the business that's renting.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. If I just have a quick question, I was wondering why we couldn't take Hip Camp out of it. you said it kind of muddied the waters. Why can't we just delete that out of what we're checking on?
That's a good question, Mayor Weldon, and I think that's something that as we move forward and continue to report on this data to the assembly, you know, I look to hear from I think from you all about what is it that you want to see, and if there are things like that that no, it's really not helpful to see the campsites and the hip camp data in there. We can, you know, we can filter it out. There are certain, like this chart that we're looking at is prepared by the contractor. It's kind of a canned chart that we don't really have control over, so it's going to include some of that stuff. If we want to continue to look at a chart like this, but for a lot of the other charts that I created, absolutely have the ability to filter very different ways and do some more manipulation of the data, depending on what it is that the assembly wants to see.
I have to ask, like, are there campsites on Hip Camp that are not the normal Park Service cabins, etc., that you would expect to see?
Chair Treem, absolutely. There's a couple glamping sites, campsites out there. But for the most part, like the federal campsites, OCREC is on there, and the public Forest Service cabins. But yeah, then there are these glamping sites out there.
Very interesting. Ms. Gladaszewski.
I don't have a question. I have a motion, so.
Okay, I have one more question. Mr. Rogers, we spoke about this earlier today. Can you give us an update on your efforts to communicate with Airbnb about them collecting sales tax and bed tax for us?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Dream. So I'm trying. It is difficult to get a live wire with a company as big as Airbnb. I've been trying for several months. I was on the phone with a customer service representative for more than an hour trying to just communicate what my needs were. Many months went by, and I eventually got an email from somebody at Airbnb who had a tax compliance title. And I told that individual at the time that we wanted to engage in an agreement where Airbnb would collect hotel bed tax and sales tax on behalf of the city of Borough Juneau. That has not moved forward. So not for my part, I'm waiting to hear from them. As I've been talking with Mr. Palmer, very difficult to get a big company to do something for you unless they voluntarily participate or unless you sue them. So I don't know. We're going to keep working on it. My understanding is that continues to be the direction from the assembly to attempt to do that, and we will continue to attempt to do that, but it is a slog.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. And I'll say anecdotally from my day job, I have heard from other communities around the state that they're having the same difficulties with Airbnb. Ms. Hughes-Scandies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I just realized I have a question, but it's sort of, I don't know what motion Ms. Gladaszewski is going to make, but I guess a question on, you know, the sort of wrap up on, you know, what does permitting get us and sort of some of the benefits of it. I suspect there may be more things we want to do regarding short-term rentals and restricting them or putting some kind of city damper on it. And when we've talked about this before, you know, if there's like sort of a little hill of complexity and like really low-hanging fruit is like permitting them, like seems like no brainer. But then there can be permit fees and there can be limited permits in a community. And so maybe I should just wait and see what the motion is, but I guess I would ask Mr. Rogers if he has an opinion to weigh in on, yeah, you tried, like the memo and the presentation talks about what we get for permitting, but it doesn't talk about any of the other things you can do with permits. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Can someone take the presentation down?
Yeah, thank you. So I think probably words here matter just a little bit. I think the finance department has come because of our experience with Harmari and seeing how other jurisdictions are dealing with this. I think we have come to the opinion that we could do our work better with a registration program, meaning we just need to assign a unique number to every single unit and require at the same time that owners display that registration number in their listing. That's really it. That allows us to meet our own objectives for compliance with hotel bed tax and sales tax. We think of that not so much as a permitting program, but it's simply a registration program. We're just trying to identify individual short-term rentals by unit and connect them back to the business that's responsible for collecting and filing sales taxes. Obviously, a registration program is going to significantly improve the data that Ms. Kostick just showed you. But part of the problem with the data is that we don't have a registration program. If we had a registration program, I think we could show you much better data. So I think with a registration program, we could be giving you much more accurate data. You could make better decisions on it. That is a registration program is quite different, or it's really like a baby step toward a program that you might think of as a permitting regime or a regulatory program, where we would have certain requirements that we expect these units to meet, or that we would limit the number, or we would limit the locations or the ownership, just the management of the units. I am not entering in necessarily to that policy debate. I'm saying I think that for the finance department's objectives in collecting hotel bed tax and sales tax, there is definitely now a known incentive for a registration program at the very least.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And I appreciate that. Yeah, you don't want to weigh in on the policy question. I'll chew on that and see what Ms. Gladaszewski says.
Okay, Ms. Gladaszewski.
Yeah, I was just going to make a motion to have staff craft a registration program and an ordinance. I think that's just the first step in anything. I don't think we have enough discussion about it, whether we want to limit it or how big, but it just seems like we have to have a registration. We have these businesses that we don't even know that they exist, and it's just kind of first step. It's also curious to me, years ago when I was on the planning commission, I mean, we had long debates about Airbnb, or not what weren't called bed and breakfast in neighborhoods, and people came to testify about whether they wanted their neighbor's house to be a bed and breakfast, and there was a lot of opinions about that, and it went on for hours. And so suddenly now we don't do that at all. Everybody just registers it. We don't even know who they are. So anyway, I'm not clear how all the zoning thing, how we've gotten around. There is in our zoning code about bed and breakfasts, and we say we're going to permit them, which we haven't done in years. So that's weird. But anyway, I moved what I said, which is have staff craft a registration permit program and draft an ordinance.
Okay. Any objection to Ms. Gladaszewski's motion? Seeing none, that motion is passed, and we will bring that back when it is ready.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Thinking about the future
future regulation, restriction, whatever. I mean,
I'm understanding that, we can get better data and this and that. I'm also somewhat concerned that there's been essentially a doubling of listings in the last year. I mean, it doesn't have to be, we're obviously going into budget season and all that type of stuff, but I mean, I personally would like for staff to, I completely understand and would never ask them to tell us what to do on this. This is why we get paid the big bucks, obviously, in terms of regulating and making those type of policy calls. However, they are very good at like saying, hey, here's what other places do, here's what Sitka does, blah, blah, blah. And maybe even running it through their much more experience and subject matter expert minds on, are there legal implications you know, what maybe does and doesn't make sense. It also based on what we see in Juneau. Maybe partying isn't such a big problem like I know it is in other places. So that's maybe not something we have to worry about. I mean, I would like to see something in the future. I don't know if I just don't want to wait a year until, you know, the registration is in, but I mean, I don't know. I'll give something a shot. I'd request that after the budget season, staff come back to the finance committee with, a list of reasonable, and that's with their interpretation, or a selection of potential regulatory or restrictions for a future discussion. But anyway, just to get that queued up and for them to, just to bring it back in a few months or something. Anyway, thanks. I'll stop.
And I believe that there's already been some work done on this. I think I remember that Mr. Chambor maybe has presented some information about this to us, so we can certainly include that too when we bring this topic up again.
That might suffice. I mean, just, I know we had seen data on the number of, on the ownership of, and those type of things, and multiple owners and out of state owners and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, all of that, coming back at some point would be nice. And, a nice shortened list of, again, reasonable topics would be my preference. I can't remember what he gave us before, but.
I think we can do that. Ms. Euskandis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I think Mr. Smith, I share your concern. I think I have a real sense of urgency about this particular issue. But I was going to say, I think we looked at it at the cow, and I think probably the cow or lands is the appropriate place for it. Since we also have housing in the title. And I was just going to say, I've been working with Mr. Chambor and with other staff on different ideas, Mr. Palmer. So I think that as people are bringing policy ideas to staff, we'll probably expect to see him in a more appropriate committee as staff has time, whenever that is.
Ms. Hale.
There, I did it right that time. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Euskandis. I think the Lands, Housing and Economic Development Committee would be appropriate to take sort of the gnarly details, and then that committee can kind of hash through them and make a recommendation to the full assembly. And I also think we may want to think about giving this a little bit of time, because if we institute a registration program, we're going to get a lot better information. And I'm guessing that registration program is going to include details that are going to help sort out that noise that Ms. Kostick talked about. And so, without that information, we're still kind of shooting in the dark. So it'd be great if we waited some period of time for information, and then the whole assembly, I don't think, needs to hash over everything in great detail. Maybe the committee could do it first.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Ms. Gladchevsky.
Yeah, basically the last two speakers said basically what I think. It needs to, the manager can, it's not necessarily a finance thing. It's not the finance people that are going to know about land use and how many there should be and all that kind of thing. So, and the lands housing committee is a great one. COW could see it eventually, but I share Mr. Smith's desire to keep the ball moving for sure. And I also think we could get some information first, and, not have to wait a year for it, but some time.
I'm just going to come off mute out of order and say also housing crisis.
Yes, on all of our minds. Okay, so that we're gonna wrap up that topic and take a very, very quick, like 3-minute break. and then return and power through the rest of our agenda. Okay, thank you. We will come back and move on to agenda topic 6, Capital Civic Center appropriation. Who gets to kick this one off? Mr. Rogers? Mr. Watt? Somebody?
The mayor requested it, so I think it is what it is. So I don't know if the mayor wants to speak to it. I don't have anything to add. You've talked
Okay.
about this with you before.
Okay. Mayor Weldon.
Thank you. Yes, this is what we talked about before. It will be introduced on Monday, and basically we worked very hard, and thank you for Mr. Rogers. I poked at the hotel bed tax fund and he found 2.5 million. So, and the reason I know people are, we're trying to be very disciplined about keeping things into the budget, but Senator Murkowski has to make her decision list by April 6th. And if we waited until April 5th, that would be too late. So on the advice of her staff and our lobbyists, they asked us to move on it now. So at this time, I would just make a motion to move ordinance number 2022-06BAJ to the full assembly.
I have some questions, and it looks like others maybe do as well, maybe. And I recognize it's getting late, but since this is going to come to the full assembly, regular assembly next, I think this might be the time to ask them. We have a legislative priority list, and this is not the top thing on the list. So those congressionally directed spending requests, did we say that this was the one that we were going to ask for, or what's the, Ms. Kester was briefly answering my questions earlier, but I don't think I remember long enough ago, a month ago, to remember what we did on this. Maybe Mr. Watt can answer.
Thank you, Chair. So the way it's worked in past years is last year, the Assembly passed the legislative priority list. And then we present that whether to the legislature through CAPCIS or to Senator Murkowski's office through her staff, and say, here are projects, what are the fits? And then we just go with them. And that's how we ended up with the municipal composting congressionally directed spending. They found a fit and they said, do you have a project for this? So I imagine this same type of thing would happen.
Okay, Ms. Hughes-Candies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. That's, yeah, I was having the same thought because I was re-looking at our finalized list, and this makes the top 10, but it's the 10th. So, and I was looking at the form earlier today on that's live on Murkowski's CDS site. So what, or Mr. Watt, you're saying we do like 10 submissions or 20 submissions and see what the fit is, or this is, could you clarify that? Because that's like a whole form you fill out and you.
If Ms. Kester is listening, she could give you a better, more detailed answer.
Oh yeah, maybe we can bring her over.
And then Miss or Mayor Weldon, while she's coming over, you said, you know, I get why you did this timing wise, but there is money in there for design, etc. already. So could you speak to that, or maybe Ms. Kester can answer my question?
I'll let Ms. Kester start, and then if I need to fill in anything after, I will.
All right. Thank you for the question. So I'm going to start with the question on how does congressionally directed spending work, given we've done like 6 months of public process for our legislative priorities. So the congressionally directed spending is not as clear cut as with our legislative priority list. We just dump that entire list, all 23 priorities, we upload that into CAPCIS. However, with the kind of revitalization of earmarks, there are certain buckets for funding, and these buckets reflect existing grant programs. So it's why you often see a lot of opportunities for EPA funding, because that's a priority, and why we were able to secure municipal composting fund. So if you recall, at the January 26th Committee of the Whole, there was a memo presented that said, this is how congressionally directed spending works. This is where we are with the funding that we secured last year and what we submitted last year. And this is how we anticipate it will go this year based on our experience, right? Based on what buckets of money were available, sub accounts or sub funds, I think they're called. And so at that time, so in that memo, we talked about, and I'm just pulling it up here, we talked about requesting Juneau North Douglas Crossing municipal, Juneau North Douglas Crossing, CBJ radio system replacement, Mendenhall wastewater treatment plant, Capital Civic Center, and Lemon Creek multimodal path as projects that would be a good fit. And I know since then we have reassessed that list with Ms. Catchell, and I'm just looking at it quickly to see if anything has changed. Oh, Auk Bay Breakwater is something that's on that list, just again, because there's a specific fit with the Corps when working with the Corps on that project for quite some time. So those are the projects that Ms. Catchell is recommending that we apply for this year. The second question was on design funding, and there was $2 million appropriated by CBJ for design to kind of bring the project to a level of design where there could be a more confident cost estimate provided. And that work has been done to a conceptual level. So a lot of space analysis, what can we get rid of, what do we really need, has been done. And that was presented to the body at the January 26th Committee of the Whole. And we've only spent about, I say only, but we've spent about 200,000 of that $2 million appropriation. Did I answer the body's questions?
Are you good, Ms.?
Yeah, I think you did. I guess, yeah, it's good to know which ones we picked and that we said that already. I'll just note for the members that there's a section on there where it says, are you design and permitting ready if it's that kind of project? And yeah.
Mayor Weldon.
And just to add a little bit, so we are going through the design process, and as you may or may not know, we're also looking at phasing, and so that's why the $2 million that Ms. Huscanis is talking about is a little bit held up. It's there, but it's going to be spent. It's just we're trying to figure out the avenue, the path. I should say the avenue, the path forward. But you know, we're just following the advice of Senator Murkowski's staff and our lobbyist, and as Ms. Kester said, there's buckets, and this one with a couple of the other ones you heard her say fall outside of the other buckets that could apply for, and they said this may help us get something because we're in competition with a lot of other projects around the state, so we're around the nation, actually, I should say. So this is just trying to get it moving forward, and we have to remember as we move this forward, it's not just for the performance section, it's for Centennial Hall. And I think we've decided a while ago that we're all in on that, and my projects in general, and let alone the Civic Center. So like I said, unfortunately it's a little bit out ahead of where we wanted to be in our ask, but the timing unfortunately is now. So
okay. Thank you, Mayor Weldon. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate folks responding to opportunities, potential opportunities here. But I'm curious about the amount, the 5 million, where that came from. And it's, you know, my understanding is that you know, we're trying to show commitment. And so I'm curious about, you know, we just made a $2 million commitment. There's $1 million in passenger fees that I believe are in the passenger fee proposal, like is 8 million. What is suggested that we as a community need to commit to get someone's attention? Where did that 5 come from?
Mayor Weldon, do you have an answer for that?
The same answer that I've just given. We're just going on the advice of Senator Murkowski's staff and our lobbyists, and they're the ones that came up with 5 million to show that we're still very interested. And we had a big ask. We had $35 million ask. I mean, we have to show that we have some skin in the game, and $2 million wasn't going to do it, quite honestly. So that's where the 5 million came from.
Okay, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 questions, I guess.
One, so reading the first whereas, and it said, you know, it says that this appropriation should not be expended until such time as sufficient grant funding is secured for the project that require local matching funds in the amount of this appropriation. So this is kind of just going to go into, I don't know the accounting, but it's going to be, you know, taken off the books, but obviously not spent until that time. So we're kind of just banking some. Is that correct? Anybody?
Sorry, my buttons seem to be getting sticky, but yes, that is exactly right. We just didn't want to say, here's another $5 million. We wanted to say that we have grants that are going to be, that they would be contingent on having sufficient grant funding secured. So there is a caveat on that. So this isn't just here's $5 million. This is here's $5 million to leverage grant funding. And if you don't get the grant funding, we won't spend the $5 million.
And then another one, Madam Chair, if I may.
Yeah.
Just on the hotel bed tax, I'm just trying to figure out how there's $2.5 million
in hotel bed tax that we can appropriate. I don't.
Might be Mr. Rogers'
I was
question.
gonna say that's a Mr. Rogers question, but initially it came from, I remembered we talked about hotel bed tax when we were talking about it before the budget, that we had, I want to say like $300,000 to $400,000 a year extra. So I was thinking in 5 years' time, we'd come up with 2. And then with Mr. Mr. Rogers, I'll let him tell what he did to figure out the rest.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I won't belabor this. We will look at this more when we're in the budget process. But Ms. Beagle and I have been working on hotel bed tax, both revenue forecast for this year and also just a fund forecast for where we're at. It's really just, I mean, there is sufficient balance, we believe, in this current year accumulated for this $2.5 million, or we wouldn't have put it forward like this. We do not believe it will cause the fund to go negative. And it's really just the result of hotel bed tax revenues in both the prior year and the current year being vastly under forecast by myself. I just did not anticipate both demand and inflation's impact on hotel bed tax revenue sufficiently.
And Madam Chair, if I could jump in, and the reason I picked hotel bed tax, if you guys recall, it is attached to Centennial Hall. A big chunk of that goes to Centennial Hall.
Madam Chair, I know I just followed up on it, but I now actually have another follow-up on this too, and that's, if I may.
Quickly.
Thank you. It's just, so you believe there's sufficient balance without taking it negative. I mean, and that is after paying the normal things that we do from hotel bed tax, supportive travel, Juno, and all the other things. I mean, there's just want to make sure that we're not going to, like, in 3 months have to say, oh, we have to support travel general funds or something, or just so I know. Anyway.
No, Mr. Smith, to be perfectly clear, all of those amounts are already reserved from the fund. So all of the current year commitments we will make, even with the $2.5 million appropriation, and then obviously next year's appropriations to those organizations would come out of next year's revenue.
Very good, thank you.
Ms. Gladaszewski.
Just a quick comment. Thank you, Madam Chair. On the mayor's motion, I fully support it. I just reminds me of anyone who went to AML Senator Murkowski got up to talk about what she had said to the legislature, basically tough love and, you gotta have skin in the game. I've come with buckets and buckets of federal money. And so she said that message to legislature, she said it to AML, and I just think it's a perfect thing, if we're expecting to get, or hoping to get money from the federal government, we have to show that we're all in. And there's really no risk here in the sense of we're not going to spend this money on anything until the federal money comes. So I think it's just a great thing. And I thank the mayor for finding for the hotel bed tax too, because it's super appropriate use of the bed tax because it's Centennial Hall money. So half and half, that's like perfect in my opinion. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I have a question that might be for Director Kester. So the other things that are on the list from the memo from January, the radio system replacement, the fog, the wastewater treatment fog removal, Lemon Creek multimodal path. We have committed some money to 2 of those things, although not that much money. And I don't believe that we've put any money towards the wastewater treatment needs. And so I understand politically that those things might be different than a shiny new civic center, but should we not also be appropriating money for those projects if we want them to do well in this process? Or is there a reason that it's just the civic center that needs this, visible show of commitment from the assembly?
If that question's for me, Chair Treem, I would, 2 things. The CBJ has appropriated $2.5 million to CBJ radio system replacement, not appropriated. You've committed because you have included that in your 1%, 2 million in your 1%. Lemon Creek multimodal path has about 1.5 million committed in 1%, and I believe $1 million in fund balance. No, anyway, some fund balance. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number, but I'm scanning my memo to see it. Capital Civic Center, of course, has the 2 million treatment plant. You're correct. You don't have specific funds appropriated to that project. The utility does have a fund balance that can be used if with some flexibility if we were to be able to leverage federal funds. So those projects have some level of buy-in, I would say, from the assembly. And so the second question you had, or the second part of that question was, why aren't we appropriating a large amount of money to any of these other projects that we want to be competitive? And I think the challenge with Capital Civic Center as a congressionally directed spending request is the bucket that it falls into is a competitive, a competitive sub account. It's where the HUD funds go. It's where anything that's, housing or homeless shelters, or it's really has a high demand for appropriations. Senator Murkowski does not sit on that appropriations subcommittee where she is a ranking member of other appropriations subcommittees where she has other sway. So the advice was, this is a more difficult project and might need more, might need us to put our best foot forward to be competitive.
Okay, thank you, Director Kester. Okay, I don't see any more hands raised, so that'll take us back to the mayor's motion. Is there any objection to that motion? Ms. Euskandis?
No need to speak to it.
Okay, Ms. Spiegel, will you please call our roll?
Thank you, Chair Treem. On the motion to move ordinance 2022-06 BAJ to the full assembly. Mayor Walden.
Yes.
Assemblymember Euskandis.
Yeah.
Assemblymember Hale.
Yes.
Assemblymember Wall.
Yes.
Assemblymember Gladys.
Yes.
Assemblymember Bryson.
Yes.
Assemblymember Buckle Godot,
Yes.
Assemblymember Smith,
Yes.
Chair Train.
Yes.
Motion passes, 8 ayes, 1 nay.
Okay. We will move right along to agenda topic 7, general obligation and revenue bond ordinances. Mr. Rogers.
Okay, thank you, Chair Treem. I'm going to try and get you through the rest of this agenda as rapidly as we reasonably can. Let me share my screen here. I just want to look at one thing in the general obligation bond. So the general obligation bond is $6.6 million for park improvements that was approved in the fall. The only thing I'm highlighting here is that the debt structure, meaning how much we pay off year by year for this bond, is rather unusual. I have worked with our financial advisor to structure this debt to be paid off over 6 years. And the thing that I do is, you see that in maturity year 2023, which is not FY23, that will be FY24, that amount, which is more than $2.8 million, because you're not seeing premium, and I won't go into selling bonds at par or at premium or at discount here, but that amount, which will be a little more than $3 million, about half of the bond, is structurally going to be paid off in the first year. And the reason that happens is that it takes full advantage of the debt service mill rate at its current level of 1.20. So basically, we pay as much of the bond off as possible in the first year without causing the debt service mill rate to go up. And then the remainder of the bond is paid off over the next 5 years, which is a pretty short amortization, but otherwise it's a very small bond. So the bond is being structurally created, sold in such a way that we'll pay about half of it off in the first year in order to take advantage of as much, to obviously retire debt as quickly as possible without causing the mill rate to go up, the debt service mill rate. Any questions on that? If there aren't questions on that, I'll just move quickly on. Obviously, these ordinances are long. Those of you who've been on the assembly have seen them many times before. Let me see if I can find, it actually doesn't so much matter. The dock bond for shore power is a $5 million bond. We've discussed this at length before. It authorizes or would fund the purchase of 2 transformers. I just wanted to show you this. This is what we call a level amortization over 15 years. That's the structure we chose for the dock bond. This is a revenue bond. It commits passenger fees only for repayment of these bonds. And this is what we consider to be a quote unquote level amortization, because our total debt service payment would be about the same in every year. It doesn't look like that here because you're only seeing the principal amounts. You're not also seeing the interest, but principal and interest, just like your mortgage, is engineered to be approximately the same amount of payment every year for the next 15 years. I think that's the only 2 things I wanted to point to here real quickly. Otherwise, these bonds, the underlying projects for these bonds have been well discussed, and obviously the public voted on the general obligation, or the general obligation bond, 6.6 million for parks. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I think these are ready to move on to the assembly.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Really quickly, when are the 16B docks supposed to be paid off?
Sorry for this very random.
Mr. Smith, I don't have that answer at my fingertips. I'm remiss in not remembering. It's not too long into the future.
Just
I can get that. I can get the answer back to the committee.
It's not terribly
I guess, the one thing is just.
All good. Thank you.
Any other questions on these? Mayor Weldon.
Actually, I didn't have a question. I was jumping because it didn't look like anybody had a question.
Yeah.
I have a motion.
Do it.
On the advice of the attorney, I'm going to move both of these separately. I move ordinance number 2023-12 to the full assembly and ask for unanimous consent.
Okay, I see no objection. That motion passes.
And I move ordinance serial number 2023-13 to the full assembly and ask for unanimous consent.
And I see no objection to that one either. That one passes. Okay. Moving on, export manufacturing exemptions, Mr. Rogers.
So thank you, Chair Treem. These are on pages 89, I think, and 89 and 90. You'll see a breakdown of the 4 businesses in Juneau that now qualify or have applied for export manufacturing exemptions. You can see the various calculations of them, and you can see the assessor's recommendation to the assembly that these be approved in compliance with the law. Unless there are any questions, I think that a motion to approve these is in order.
Okay, any questions on those? Okay, Mayor Weldon.
I move that we approve the applications listed below for the export manufacturing exemption.
And ask for unanimous consent.
Well, I'm debating what I think this has to go to the full assembly also, so we ask for unanimous consent.
Okay, well, I see no objection either way, so that motion passes. Okay, Mr. Rogers, take us through what else we need to know tonight.
So thank you, Chair Treem. The very last thing is a memo that I added to your packet today. It's on a page 124 of the packet's very last page. If you're seeing the packet with the supplemental items, if not, it was sent to you separately. This is a memo just disclosing that the Juneau School District was the victim of a financial fraud to the tune of about $269,000 in 2 separate transactions in October and November. We were alerted of that fraud on December 7th and immediately began working with the FBI, JPD, our bank, and CBJ Law to respond. Very similar to the scheme that CBJ fell victim to 4 years ago, shortly before I started. Sad, unfortunate circumstance. Obviously, the people involved, the staff directly involved feel bad. I don't know what more to say about this. It's really a school district issue, but I thought it was becoming important to disclose this both to the assembly and to the public at this time. I'll take any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions on that? Ms. Gladaszewski.
Just one quick one. Thanks, Madam Chair. When the thing happened to the city, did the city then tell all the other our other sister entities about it? And, you know, like the hospital and the school district and anybody who needed to know so that they could not fall victim to the same thing? What happened to that information? Did they get it?
I mean, Assemblymember Gladaszewski, I'd have to go back and see if I sent an email to the school district that said, watch out for this. I mean, but the eminent reality is that this particular scheme is very common. You can't listen to a webinar about fraud. You can't go to a financial conference. You can't step out your front door without hearing that this is really a very successful method for fraudsters to use, which is to call and say, I represent a vendor and I want you to change my banking instructions. It is the most common fraud on the street today. Again, to be unaware of this particular technique at this time means you haven't been paying attention.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Weldon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just looking at the memo, it seems like the school district could make a claim on this, correct, and get some money back?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The CBJ risk manager has reached out to the school district a number of times on this item and doesn't have the information that they need to proceed with the claim. I can't speak to that anything more than that. I know that there has been communication from the CBJ risk manager to the school district, and there has not been communication back.
Okay. Any more questions on this item? Okay, that was the end of our agenda. Anything else to come
Sorry.
before the meeting? Oh,
Sorry, Madam
yeah.
Chair, can I just ask Mr. Rogers? What do you mean they haven't communicated back? I mean, don't they communicate back? I mean, it's a fraud? Are they, you don't know what they're doing about it?
Assemblymember Golashevsky, I do not know what they're doing about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else to come before the finance committee meeting tonight? No. Okay, we will meet again on April 5th. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.